So excuse me if I am occasionally distracted. Thanks for joining us today. Ours is a space that discusses developments in the news. We use a lot of mainstream news sources, but we like to accent that heavily through the use of open source information, a lot of which is collected by great accounts that are here on Twitter. We also like to share tools and tips so that whether you're new to open source work or you've been at it for a while, hopefully we can bring everybody's skill level up at the same time. I also like to try to invite guests in who are doing interesting work so that we can share their projects with the group. And in that way, hopefully, people who are interested in similar topics can get together and build up a little bit of collaboration. These spaces rely heavily on the use of the nest, which is the area at the top of the spaces window where links to individual tweets can be posted. And so I've just been adding to it as I was doing the introduction. If you were to scroll to the far right-hand side, you'll see that that's the invitation to our space. Behind that invitation, if you click through it, there is the agenda. Unfortunately, the agenda posted today separately. It wouldn't post as one thread, so I had to append it. If you look at the agenda, it has all of my speaking notes. The reason I do that is so that you don't have to take my word for more or less anything I'm saying. You'll have the source as well. And also, if anything catches your attention, that you'll have a start for reading material that you can take away with you. If you are interested, do have a look through the agenda. And in that way, in advance, you might develop questions and comments. We invite comments from the audience. If you want to come up and speak with us, you can always request a microphone by hitting the button in the bottom left corner of the Spaces window. And because we'd like to get as many people into the conversation as possible, if you're enjoying our talk, then as we go along, consider retweeting it. You can do that by hitting the button in the bottom right-hand corner of the Spaces window. We have a mixed group of presentations today. We're going to hear about some work done recently by David Helms on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. My co-host Exit, who I think you all know has been following the Black Sea Grain Initiative closely, is going to give us an update on the situation as it stands at the moment, because the current deal is set to expire tomorrow. And as far as I know, there's been no resolution to extend that at this point. And then we've also invited some friends of ours who are interested in developments with Wagner. So our friend Cassispelli has joined us, and hopefully we'll be joined by our friend OPSEC and maybe one or two others later on, so that we can have a bit of a roundtable just to understand how the close observers of Wagner are watching them, what they're looking out for, and what they think might come next. But before we get to those conversations, I'm going to do a quick roundup of some resources, podcasts, and so on. I do this in the first couple of minutes just to let the space populate, fill up. And that way, if you show up in the first 10 or 15 minutes that you'll hear about, the tools and resources. So if you're into the minutia of it, you might like the first couple of minutes. So I'm going to work through the nest. I'm starting on the far right-hand side. The first tweet on the far right-hand side, as I mentioned, is the invitation to today's space with the agenda in that thread. The second item from the right is just a reminder that Friends of Our Space are live streaming our conversation to YouTube. And I'd always encourage you to participate here on Twitter, because on Twitter you can come up as a speaker. But if you ever miss a discussion that you'd like to catch up on, or if you remember a conversation we talked about on a previous discussion that you want to go back and revisit, check out that YouTube channel of our friends. The third item in the nest on the right is our community calendar. We set this up because we have a couple of friends who host conversations, both on the war in Ukraine and also more broadly on OSINT work. We set it up to collaborate among ourselves, but then we thought, well, we should include some outside events. So we have put on talks from universities and think tanks. If you were to click the link there to the Team Up calendar, it will open in a browser. And then if you open individual entries in the calendar, it'll either take you to a registration link for upcoming events, or if the event's already occurred, it will usually have a recording. And then, of course, the Twitter events, which are color-coded, will usually have an invite, so you can set a reminder. There were a couple of interesting podcasts in the last few days. I'm not going to break these out individually to the nest at the moment. I will speak to them. So again, if you look in the nest, third from the right, under the title Calendar and Podcasts, you can find these links. So there was an episode of the podcast, the Global Security Briefing, which is put together by the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI. They spoke with Ivo Dalder, who was an ambassador to NATO, and they had a conversation about what role Washington might play in shaping Europe's future security arrangements. And this is in light of the results coming out of the Vilnius NATO summit. There is also a podcast, podcast put together by Al Monitor, which focuses on the Middle East. And they spoke with an expert, Nicholas Danforth, who covers matters in Turkey. And they were discussing whether Erdogan is turning away from Russia in favor of America and Europe, which is a subject we've discussed in our talks several times. There's also a podcast called War and Peace that's put together by the Crisis Group. And in their latest episode, they discussed the travel ban for men leaving Ukraine. And they also discussed efforts toward the protection of civilians in wartime. The remainder of the podcast items are in the next tweet because I ran out of character limit. And so that one's, it's the fourth from the right that begins with the term July 16th Spaces Agenda, because unfortunately the thread broke as it posted. But there was also a new episode of the podcast Geopolitics Decanted, which is done by Dmitry Alperovich. And he spoke with Michael Kaufman and Rob Lee, two of the leading experts on Ukraine. They all had actually traveled to Ukraine, I think, a little over 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago now. And I believe their talks came from this visit. Of course, Michael Kaufman came and spoke with us about a week and a half ago. But it's always nice to hear his thoughts. So check out Geopolitics Decanted. There's also a new episode of the Foreign Office podcast, which is hosted by Michael Weiss. And in this episode, they speak to Estonia's ambassador to Ukraine to discuss the counteroffensive and Turkey's role in helping Kiev. And then finally, there are two more. There's also in that tweet, there's the note that friends of ours who run the OSINT Bunker podcast, and that's, I think that's OSINT Technical, is it Defense Geek? And often they'll have Austin and occasionally Allsource on as guests. And they've now launched a website to bring together their resources so that you can find links to all of their podcast episodes there. And then finally, there's one upcoming event that's on tomorrow. It's being hosted by Chatham House, and it is a look inside wartime Russia. So looking at the effects of sanctions, mobilization, propaganda, and what effects the Wagner Rebellion are having on Russian society. So you can go to their link and sign up to listen to their talk online. I think that's it for podcasts. I'll run through a handful of resources, and then we'll move on to some of our guests. So if you have a look in the nest, it's now the fourth from the left. It's the tweet that's titled "Resources." This I just take things as they cross my feed over the couple of days between our discussions. So I'm not going out and searching for these because there's so much, great OSINT work that we can't cover nearly at all. So these are the things that come across my feed, and often they'll group together in themes. And so this first group of resources relates to OSINT work in Africa and the Middle East. And I like to highlight that because even though we often discuss Ukraine, we're open to discussing techniques and good work wherever it may come from. So in that set of resources, I'll break these out individually into the nest so they're a little bit easier for you to see. So if you just bear with me while they go up. The first of these sets of material is from the the ACLED, and they are tracking violent events in the Sahel, so northern Africa, and they have a much broader, sort of a global level of data collection. I believe they also track events in Ukraine. I know that some of our friends like Sam Bendet have really appreciated the work that they've done on drone strikes in Russia and Ukraine. So check out the ACLED resources, which should populate in just a moment, if you've never looked into them. Great, should all be up in the nest now. The second item back in the nest is an update from a regular watcher of events on the ground in Sudan, Thomas Van Ling. So he is one of 2 or 3 mappers. For example, War Mapper, who also does work in Ukraine, has a Sudan map as well. But in this way, you can understand the different factions that are involved. There is also close work being done by an account called the Sudan War Monitor, and I only found this account about a week ago, but they're doing regular updates similar to the many that you may be familiar with for events in Ukraine. They're doing a daily breakdown of events for the fighting that's ongoing in Sudan. So you may want to add them to your lists. One thing that caught my attention, the fourth item back in the nest, it's a tweet from Benjamin Strick, or Bendu Brown, who works for the Center for Information Resilience and does a ton of OSINT work. He noted that the International Criminal Court has now set up a collection form, and they're calling for people to submit information to human rights abuses in Darfur. And so I guess number one, I know we do have some Africa-focused researchers who listen to our conversations. This might directly be relevant to you. What caught my attention was this idea of the International Criminal Court using a data collection form and actually calling for information, which I think is really interesting. I wonder whether that's a strategy that they'll pursue with regard to Ukraine. Yeah, if anybody has any contacts at the International Criminal Court, maybe what I'll do is reach out to Ben to see if he knows who created this form and put it out. But it would be really interesting to reach out to them just to understand what their collection methodology is like, and if somebody was to submit data, what would happen to it next, and sort of what formats of data submission are most useful to them. The fifth item back in the nest, last item in this block, is a tweet from the U.S. Army, Intel Group 2. This is actually a couple of weeks old now, about 3 weeks old, but they announced the release of the Department of the Army's military intelligence branch, who put out their OSINT strategy for the period 2023 to 2030. I took about 5 minutes when I found this announcement the other day to try to find that document. Given that they're announcing its release publicly, I assume it is a publicly available document, but I haven't been able to find it. So I'm doing what I advocate and saying, if you guys have any thoughts on where it can be found, I'd love to help, and shoot me a link, because I think that document will be pretty interesting. And I heard about it because there was an intelligence conference held this week where some members from that U.S. Army Group 2 were speakers, and the name of the conference escapes me at the moment. If you were to check my feed, I tweeted about it, I think, yesterday. Last group of resources, I will break these out to the nest as well. So the first of these is speaking to the importance of error checking in OSINT work. And it's put up by, I believe the account is Archie Irving, who's been working with the ORIX group. And in particular, Archie has been looking for duplicates in the ORIX image records. And one thing ORIX has said is one of his regrets is not keeping a change log of the database of photo losses. Which that's a good point he makes, that it would be helpful to understand the integrity of the data if he had done that. And so not everybody who is submitting corrections keeps a record, but Archie has done that. And so he's put together a graph showing duplicate rates for the various vehicles. And he notes that he has found 110 duplicates in total. So I partly put this up because of the importance of checking your data to building legitimacy, but also because it was just last week that another contributor to the ORIX project noted, look, I post errors in their data all the time, but every single one that I've posted, they've corrected. And if you were to count the number of errors that I've found as a percent of the total losses, it's less than 1%. And so in that way, you get kind of a statistical measure of the rate of error, which is really interesting. The second item in the nest at the moment is a tweet from our friend Nalcio, who works with the ORIX project. And that's his ongoing summary of losses in just in the offensive, to break it out separately. And it's interesting, first of all, to see that the losses are about 1-to-1 for Ukraine and Russia, considering that Ukraine is on the offensive. It's often talked about how the attacker has to have quite a higher ratio of forces. And we're not seeing that at the moment in losses data. If you were to scroll down in Nalcio, in response to Nalcio's tweet there, you'll see that I asked him that there are biases that develop in the ability to detect equipment losses. And those depend at any given time on things like, are the lines fixed? Are they flowing? How many recon assets are up and available? Drone footage. How strict is the info discipline? Do troops still have their phones? Is there like a blanket ban that is well complied with? For example, in general, the Ukrainians seem to have been fairly good, their troops, at complying with info bans, where the Russian troops seem not to have been so good. So I asked him, at the moment, how do you think those factors would break down and might affect? Are they even, or would they mean that we're not seeing as many Russian losses, we're not seeing as many Ukrainian losses? And his answer, he went briefly into some of the factors. He didn't really say whether he thought it lent one way or the other, but he did say that typically both Ukrainian and Russian losses are poorly documented when it's in Russian occupied territory, and that unless Ukraine in Ukrainian occupied territory, unless Ukraine wants to publish the data, because of their discipline, they generally don't. And when they catch destroyed equipment at the moment on the Ukrainian side, it's often because it's civilians who are getting imagery of it as it's being withdrawn for, repair or disposal. So those were interesting details. The third item back in the nest, I thought was interesting as something to track. It is speaking to the rate being paid to members of, Hezbollah. And apparently they're getting a 13% pay rise. And this follows previous tracking where a few years ago they had taken a pay cut. And it's being used as a proxy for the amount of monies made available to these efforts by Iran that may speak to their financial situation. So if they're cutting back pay, it may have been because of the strictness of enforcement of sanctions. And if they're raising pay now, either they're making it a higher priority to fund Hezbollah, or perhaps there has been a loosening of the enforcement of sanctions. So it's an interesting metric to follow. As a final item in resources, there's a link there. It's a tweet is by Jacob Janowski, who works with Oryx, but he's noting a YouTube video that was put up by Covert Cabal, where they took an effort to try to count all of the Russian artillery in the known storage yards. And they put quite a lot of work into it. And I know it's gotten recognition from many people. I haven't, tried to double check their work, but I would recommend the video to you. I think that's it for resources from the last few days. I'll move into some examples. And the first of which, I'll put this up in the nest. The first of which is from our friend David Helms, who noticed that there had been a fire near the cooling pond for the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. And I know that he's following events there extremely closely. And David was kind enough to join us to give us the rundown on his new thread. David, thanks for joining us.
Hello, hello.
So what do we see here?
So, I know we don't have much time, so I'll be brief. It was looking at the firm's data, the NASA firms, which uses MODIS and NOAA environmental satellites, SUMI and PP, to identify fire hotspots and combines that all into the firm's database. At any rate, on July 14th, 2 days ago, there was 4 fire hotspots, if you will, identified on the firm's data. They were clustered around 549 UTC and 641. And in total, 4 detection points from 2 different satellites. So that got my attention. It's about 5 kilometers, the cluster of points, about 5 kilometers west of the reactors on the retaining wall of the cooling pond, basically the western side of the retaining wall closest to Nikopol. Nikopol is about 8 kilometers from these fire points. But one interesting thing about where these fires are, it's about 600 meters just north of the spillway, which is basically all that stops the water that's in the rather large cooling pool from draining away. So that got my attention. I did a follow-up yesterday, and I looked at some of the environmental data and any corroborating evidence that would confirm a burn and that their fires existed. So the weather, there was no rain at the time, there was no lightning, winds were out of the south about 4 to 6 meters per second. I did identify, I was lucky enough to see some Sentinel-2 data, and in fact, there was a fairly larger area of burn scar in the area where the 4 firms, the grid points were for fires. And I did a phase basically between the 13th and the 15th of July with the firm's data indicating fires on the 14th, and sure enough, it was there. And just kind of, I also speculate that why would, that it's kind of weird that natural processes probably didn't cause these fires. It was not in the middle of the night, but it was just after sunrise local time, about 9 a.m. And winds were fairly light, humidity was fairly high. That's not when fires start. So this fire was likely started by humans on purpose. And the question is why. I think radio and nukes is also on. He's got some higher resolution data that he's going to post very soon. I think from Planet that confirms the burn scar, but I'll let him get to that. But my initial thing was it could be maybe two things. Why are the Russians starting fires? And from the controlled area that they control, probably could be one, they want to burn off some brush so that it's not available for cover. But my sinister mind is that it's information ops. They're starting these fires and to kind of claim that the Ukrainians are shelling the plant, and that way it's kind of a pretext when potentially in the future something goes wrong at the plant, and they can blame the Ukrainians. So that was kind of the gist of it. Radio and nukes. I don't know if you want to further comment or not.
Did you want to go ahead, Radio?
Yep, I'm here. I don't have a lot to comment. The imagery is live. It is in the nest. I just knew that there is a path on that power plant. They take pictures of it every time a satellite goes over, since it's such an important area. And I knew we could likely confirm this, so I figured I would work with David to confirm it. That's really about all I have. The imagery should be in the nest, and it certainly looks like it confirms pretty much exactly what he's saying.
Well, so a couple of things I thought were cool in what you did, David, including checking two different satellites to see whether they both registered a fire, because some people have pointed out that firms can be detecting things other than fire. So it's a good idea to cross-check. I also appreciated that because there are these known tools to check for lightning strikes and wind and humidity. Those are great context to add. Also, I didn't know until I read this thread of yours that one satellite system has a burn detection capability, even though it didn't detect anything here. Have you ever used that burn detection tool before?
You can do pattern or classification and do burn scars, and that I think that is a tool like the USGS uses Landsat for burn scars. It's in the kind of near IR visible spectrum bands that Sentinel has, that and to a lesser extent VIIRS has, Landsat of course, and so it's a pretty common practice for tracking burn areas for firefighting, and you can see that the what was the site there that I checked but didn't exist or wasn't there, the EMS, the Copernicus EMS site, and again, I was kind of calibrating what I was seeing against using the same information against known fires in the south by Oleshki. There's a forest down there that have been burning quite a bit, and in fact, there's many firms hits, if you will, for fires down there. So I was kind of making sure I was at least, testing my logic. But yeah, I think the burn area using these environmental satellites is a pretty common practice. And again, this one might show up on the European Commission's EMS site that link, but it just hasn't yet, and it's possible that it was just too small. So, but again, Radio Nukes will be posting very soon a rather interesting image from Planet of the burn area. So it certainly happened, with certitude.
This highlights the cool opportunities for collaboration, where when one person spots something, like David, who is closely watching the plant, and then knows that Radio and Nukes, enjoys and is skilled at getting the satellite photos and looking at them closely, bringing folks together is great. Exit. Go ahead.
I know, David, when we're planning to do control burns on the farm, we have to wait for specific weather. You noted that it was fairly humid there. I presume that they almost certainly would have had to use some kind of accelerant to start that fire. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I absolutely think that that's true. Yeah. To get it, because fires just don't naturally kick off with, high humidity, in these kind of, like you said, if fires are going to get started and kind of escape, if you will, the controlled burn, it's going to happen in the low humidity, high wind environment, typically in the afternoon, right? But yeah, I agree. There was accelerant, and the Planet imagery that Radio Nukes has shared with me shows a very sharp line where the burn area is, where it was started, and you could see how the burn kind of progressed to the north. There was no, in this high resolution, probably tens of meters resolution or less, probably like maybe 10 meter resolution Planet data. It didn't show any shelling impact areas, in that where you would expect that, where the fire did start.
So then I really only had one other question, and you may or may not know the answer to this, so feel free to say if you don't. If there were mines in that area, would they have gone off when that fire was burning?
I don't know for sure. I had that same thought, though, Exit, that it's possible that mines would have been triggered by that heat, but presumes that we have mines there. But hopefully Radio will be able to share his the Planet data with us very soon. But I didn't see any obvious areas where there were explosions in and near the burn area. But Radio and Nuke did identify some, shall we say, minor fortifications, some where there had been some digging just north of the spillway and south of the burn area. So anyway, hopefully we'll see that soon.
Yeah, down thread, there were some reports that in the south, Ukraine may actually have been using controlled burns in an attempt to go through minefields more quickly. So I don't know, what percent sort of effectiveness it would have, but it is a technique that is apparently being used. So we'll go to Radio and Nukes and then Wolverine. Go ahead, Radio.
Yeah, so the imagery is live. It is the second back in the nest. If you look at the imagery, if you want to pull it up and go along with me here, there is an area just to the left of the fire along the bank where you can see a few little areas that look like they may be dug in. I don't know that I didn't classify those on the imagery, but they do appear to possibly be something. I just wanted to point that out because David had said something and wanted to let everybody know that the imagery was live. And back to you, Michael.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Wolverine, go ahead.
So mines can be set off by a fire if they're hot enough. It depends on how how deep they're buried and stuff like that. Because like with our mines, especially like anti-tank mines, sometimes we'll use a rod to set it off. If it's shallower, obviously it can. But there's actually a couple of different things where in Slovenia, they actually had a wildfire that went through Slovenia, and it actually set off a bunch of mines. Now they're older mines, World War I mines. So it did set them off there. And then they had in 2018, OSCE reported errors. I can't pronounce the name of the city. It's like Berez. I don't know what it is. Anyways, but OSCE reported that 6 landmines had actually gone off due to some type of a forest fire. But it's going to be like how big the fire is and the temperatures, because a lot of it has to do with the materials that we actually use. I'm not sure because I've never dealt with like Semtex or the type of materials that they use over there. But for the United States, I'll use like C4. C4 is actually really stable. You can sit there and light it on fire and it doesn't do anything. But if it's on fire and then you apply force to it, then it actually could go off. But otherwise when I was in school, we had an instructor, had a 20-pound satchel charge, full C4, and deck cord and everything. And he was just swinging it around, and I was sitting here going, what the heck? Because I'd only been in the Marine Corps, boot camp, and then I was in SOI, School of Infantry. And this dude let loose this 20-pound satchel charge, went flying over by me, landed like 6 to 8 feet in front of me, and I thought my heart stopped. Okay, so it just depends on the materials and how stable they are, because sometimes you don't use like C4, you might use like Comp B in it or something equivalent to that. But in the end, if the hot fire is hot enough, yes, they can set the mines off.
Go ahead, OPSEC.
Yeah, so Wolverine said 2018. I think what he's probably talking about was the forest fire at Guantanamo Bay.
Well, sorry, OPSEC, I put up the reference. I found it's an ABC News article about the wildfire in Ukraine.
So in 2018, there was a wildfire that set off some of the mines at Guantanamo Bay. I think that's what Wolverine was talking about there.
No, sorry, Michael. No, I apologize. No, it's actually, if you look up in the top, Michael actually posted it, and it's 2018, and OSCE. It was something OSCE, and it had the name of the city. It's probably in Michael's thing.
It's Berezova.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you. Yes. So yeah. This story was actually reported. Actually, this wasn't 80. Yeah, so it's probably the same story that Michael actually posted then.
So I guess 2018 was a bad year for wildfires and landmines.
Yeah, well, just more data points that the right kind of fire can set them off. So to David, one last question for you. Maybe it's a two-parter. Do you think that spill gate would be susceptible to a fire, to damage from a fire? And if the spill gate were damaged, what's the likely consequence?
I don't know that, it would, there could be enough heat from the brush, the available fuel that's on the retaining wall to damage the spillway gate. However, that's, I think in the thread I dumped a picture from Google Earth, of the gate. It's nothing appears to be special of it. I think it probably could be taken out with a one shell, but I don't think a brush fire would probably harm it. Probably, mostly because there's really the brush is mostly away from it, and it's metal, so it's not going to burn. Just a further comment on mines cooking off and fires is, I think Exit and I have noted in the past this very large swath of vegetation in the quote green area, say as you go in the line of conflict. That area in the next couple of weeks is going to be increasingly dry, so it's going to be really easy to start potentially large ground fires in that area that would potentially encompass large areas and move with a good wind. So I'd maybe look for that to potentially happen in the future, and you'll probably see the firm's frequency of fires in that area start to pick up. Heretofore hasn't been that active. It's been a little bit wet, but I think it's going to dry out quite a bit.
Thanks, David. Rev Prez, you're new here, but I think you tried to unmute for a second and maybe had a question.
Yes, I did. My first question is basically, have there been any detected fires in the area before this incident?
I was not aware of any, no. And it's funny because, the day after this one was July 14th, where there was four individual grid points in that cluster on the retaining wall of the cooling pool. There was another one. So these were five kilometers west of the reactors, and then what I would call the main gate into the Zaporizhzhia NPP, about 5 kilometers southeast of the reactors. Yesterday on the 15th, there was another fire. It just gets your attention. It's not normal, in the recent past to see fires here. And it's also true that it is starting to dry out. But you wouldn't expect kind of natural occurring fires, if you will, to start at the times that we've seen these fires detected, which is about 6 UTC or about 9 local. That's it.
My second related question to that is, understanding that these fires are recent, or this particular fire is recent, is there any possibility that we can confirm whether or not there's been other controlled burns in the recent past?
The database, I think you can go back quite a ways on the NASA firms database. There's also a second database that the Europeans maintain that doesn't seem to get all the fire. It doesn't have the same detection efficiency as the firm's data, but those archives go back quite a bit for probably years. So if there's any in the recent past, that they're in the database.
And my final question is, have we actually heard anything from Ivan correlating to this particular incident?
I'm not sure of the question.
He means
have statements from.
Right. From the Russians.
Yeah.
It's weird because, we're talking about it and trying to dig down, and the OSINT folks. My assumption was Ivan would maybe leverage this information as part of information ops in the future, as part of their, look how many times there's been fires, look, that or that are quote from shelling, it could be that that's still kind of being cooked up, if you will.
To that end, I guess my alternative conclusion might be is that we're just also looking at just some basic combat engineering. They're just clearing brush.
And that's one of the potential alternatives that Radio and Nukes said, and I think is certainly in the realm of possibility.
Okay,
that's all I have.
Thanks for that back and forth, guys. We'll take Jane as a last comment on this, and then we'll move along with updates.
Yeah, I have a question, David or Radio and Nukes or whomever is the best guy here. I was reading, I believe in the New York Times, and did some checking on this, that there have been a fair number of middle-of-the-night burns going on here, that there was apparently no reason anybody could detect that they would be occurring other than they were intentional burns, and I'm curious to know what your take is on those.
Yeah, I think these are intentional. I think if they're happening generally in the absence of lightning, and they're not happening. I mean, there's absolutely intentional burns where you're trying to burn out brush, which is what Rev was talking about. And that happens in a lot of kind of firefighting roles. But if they happen at 9 in the morning, high humidities, they're intentional. Outside of lightning is my sense of the matter.
Okay, we'll let one last one come in from Wolverine.
So the one thing I'll say this is, having worked at one of the largest ammo dumps overseas, using a fire, though, to do that around mines is actually pretty stupid, though, because you do not know what will ever happen. We used to actually have people, they would literally come in with tools like the sits to cut the grass there, because we couldn't operate or they couldn't operate, like any gas powered tools or anything like that, because so that could cause an accidental ignition. That's obviously how anal the Navy was about it, but it's, they're trying to do it. There's better ways to do it, especially, depending on how, we don't know how high the grass is. We don't know if it's, 4 feet or 2 feet or whatnot. But, and if it's right up against the wall, the grass would actually serve as a good purpose to to actually hide it from someone so they wouldn't see it in your defensive positions, which is something you do want. It's if it was me and if the wall, as long as the grass wasn't interfering with fields of fire or sectors and everything like that, I would just leave it there, because they should have it marked somewhere where the mines are. They're smart, but Russians aren't always smart. But I probably wouldn't have even done that. But if they're doing it, it's because they're fucking idiots and they want to start a fire. My apologies.
So while we can't narrow down why they did it, why we can't specify why they did it, because of its proximity to the nuclear power plant, it has a bit of intrigue to it. And I thought it was just a good example of eliminating possibilities, how David had looked at there was no reported lightning, there were burn marks. It was just a little good exercise of OSINT work to go through, including now his collaboration with radio. So anyway, David, thanks very much for coming up and updating us on that, and let us know if you see anything else like that.
Will do.
Thanks. So I just before going to exit on the Black Sea Grain Initiative, I did want to highlight a handful of additional items. Some of them are just little Twitter updates. One more interesting example of OSINT work. It's the second item in the nest at the moment. It's a tweet from Evergreen Intel. She's been tracking reports whenever it's come out, a video or imagery showing Russia deploying air defense assets around Moscow in an effort to make this map of air defenses. And I was speaking with Radio a little bit because he is one of the people who has used a tool. I can't remember the name of it. Some Pixel something, Cambridge Pixel, maybe. In order to match up the capabilities of a given air defense system with the surrounding topography, so you can get a sense of what kind of line of sight air defense systems have. And it would be pretty cool to sort of take Evergreen's work and extend it, if at all possible, to get this more granular idea of what air defense around Moscow was actually seeing. I put another block of material up in the nest. I'll run through these quickly. A lot of them are Twitter related, just because we had that interesting update from David and Radio, and I know some of you guys also use satellite imagery work. There was a tweet. So let me see here. Sorry, somebody's added something else. Oh, yeah, okay. So the second item in the nest is what I'm speaking to now. It's a tweet from Oliver Alexander, who noted that if you've signed up for Twitter Blue and turned on, I don't know, do you have to turn on the ad? I don't think you actually do monetization via subscription, but you have to turn on the ad revenue somehow. But they noted that if that's the case, could that interfere with the provisions in the licensing agreements with some of these satellite imagery providers? Because if you're getting revenue, does it, complicate things? Which is a fair question. I won't go into it here, but I just wanted to flag it to the folks who are using satellite imagery to say, do have a look at the agreements. I was speaking with some people who were interested in this, and I looked at the agreements, and the answer is that it's case specific, because each of the satellite providers has their own licensing language. And then some of those satellite imagery providers sell their images through resellers who then have their own provisions. So you actually have to trace the chain down. But it certainly does seem like on Twitter, even though the OSINT accounts are sort of small players in the imagery world, it does seem a little bit like the Wild West, and some people are definitely adopting best practices, by putting up the logos and the requested marks of the satellite imagery providers, and others are not. Some are highly modifying it so that they're definitely, analytical, sort of transformed works, and some people are just posting the raw imagery. And so probably there will have to be a little bit more discipline as it comes up. And also Oliver's point was an interesting one. OPSEC, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, so I would just say, Planet and Skywatch will definitely come after you if you're posting their info and making money off of it. But I think you can mitigate that. I would say reach out to a sales rep, talk to them. They'll probably work something out with you. But yeah, if you're making money off their posts, I'm pretty sure they will come after you.
My rough impression was that Skywatch, being a newer and a newer and much smaller company, the clarity of their rules around use was lower, a fair bit lower than was the wording provided by Planet, which is a much larger established outlet. And so there is a bit of uncertainty depending on who you buy them from. But what I would also suggest is that if you're somebody who deals with these, if you hear from any of these companies, whether as a caution or a clarification, maybe reach out to me and I'll try and get the information out in an anonymized, hey, here's for the community's sake, here's what we're hearing kind of a way. Because I know lots of people are interested in this subject.
So just to add to that, we know Skywatch went after 88, so they do have people that are tracking this stuff. So just be careful. But what I would say is reach out, talk to them. They definitely can be accommodating if you're upfront with them.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Jane, go ahead.
Yeah, I just forewarn anybody that if you're using a private company's services or even a government, make sure you know what your relationship is. I have a very large account. I am watched by just about everybody, and I have had several organizations come after me for no reason at all, and I play very cleanly. So be very cautious with what you're doing and post their logos, do whatever it is they need you to do in order to use their imagery, but do it. You do not want the kind of pain that I have experienced over the years I've run this account. So be careful.
Interesting. Okay, and also OPSEC, I wasn't aware 88 had those problems, so maybe he's not as active at the moment, but maybe I'll reach out to him and ask him about his experience.
He's gone.
He's just gone.
Yeah, no, I don't think you'll hear back from him. But
okay, interesting. Okay. So just to keep running, the first item in the nest is an article that was written by Bellingcat investigating whether AI tools like ChatGPT can be used to assist in geolocation. So if you're doing any geo work and you want to explore ways to try and enhance it. I'm not sure that their experiments were very successful initially, but do check out their work. We covered the second item in the nest. The third item in the nest is also from Oliver Alexander, just noting that because Twitter changed their direct message defaults, they shifted everybody, even if you had set it previously, they shifted everybody back to the default of accepting messages from verified accounts, which I understand means if an account is not verified, it won't even go to your people you may know folder, I think is the way it works now. And the point was made that if you're an OSINT account, you're collecting info, like we had Cameron speak to us on Thursday about how he put out a request for information on ammo manufacturing, and he had dozens of people reach out to him. If his DMs were set so that non-verified accounts can't reach him, he wouldn't have gotten all that info. So if you're trying to collect info and connect with people on here, you probably want to change that. Yeah, Exit, go ahead.
Regarding Cameron's request for people to send information, I know so many of you guys sent information, and I just wanted to do a public thank you on his behalf because I know he was really pleased with that. And we've talked a lot about how it takes a community to do these kinds of things. And it's amazing that everybody's working together to help collect data. So thank you.
Yeah, I'll second that. Rev Prez, go ahead. So if you're there, Rev Prez, you may have to unmute.
Sorry about that. Has OSINT community actually thought about brokering a sort of revenue sharing relationship between social media and the imagery providers through themselves?
I don't know about through social media in the imagery providers, but I know that there are people on the platform here who do band together to take sort of collective donations into a pool, and then they'll use that pool of funds to purchase imagery. I don't think that they're buying it from a pooled account because most of the imagery providers don't permit that, but they sort of pool it, I think, at the monetary level. There may be others among us who know specifically, but it's being done, in an ad hoc way by little groups. Go ahead, OPSEC.
That's all I got.
Yeah, so I would also add, most of the OSINT accounts are not actually buying their own sat photos. So I don't think there's an appetite for people to pay to get more of that imagery. There are people that buy it and there are people that analyze it. There are people that do both, but not that I've seen in terms of actually pulling that money.
Yeah, there was so Defmon, NL War Tracker, and Artisanal APT had sort of a publicly acknowledged cooperative going on that front. And and I think there might have been one or two others, but it's not all that common, but it's definitely been contemplated. So last 2 points before we move on to the Black Sea Grain Initiative. The fourth item up in the nest is just another walkthrough of one of the OSINT puzzles put up at Grail Hicks on YouTube. We put one of these up on Thursday, so it looks like this account, Johnny Gizmo, is doing several walkthroughs of solutions, which is handy if you want to try them out. The last item back in the nest is partly for a laugh, but it kind of has a serious implication about operational security or personal security. It's the tweet.
Can anyone hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Wolverine. Can you hear me, Wolverine? He may have an audio problem, so if that's the case, we'll just rotate Wolverine around. Sorry, back to that tweet from Elliot Higgins. It's a bit of a joke, but somebody was harassing an open source investigator who then proceeded to identify exactly who they were and spell that out on TikTok. And if you have a look at the methods by which they identified the person, it's pretty funny. So that's it for all that background. I'm glad it generated conversation. It took a little longer than I expected. But we're hoping now to jump into a conversation about the current status of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. So it's always great to have Exit here with us to let us know what the latest is. Exit, thanks for co-hosting and thanks for joining.
Thank you so much. I am going to try and be a little quick because we have so much to get through today. So the basic gist of it is today is the second last day of the current cycle for the Black Sea Grain Initiative. There was one ship left in the Odessa area ports. It is now midnight 02 in Ukraine. And that ship actually left first thing this morning about the same time as the attacks were happening on Sevastopol. And I was a little bit honestly disappointed because that ship was a Turkish flagged ship. And I kind of wondered if maybe somebody wouldn't kind of push the lines and leave that ship until everything had expired and then see what Russia did if they pulled it back out. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. So that ship has left. What's interesting about this renewal period is that typically we have seen Russia and the UN or Russia and Turkey meet for negotiations, even though Russia has consistently said, oh, we're not going to renew the grain deal. They've done that a number of times over a number of renewal periods, but they've always been willing to meet with either the Turkish defense minister or the UN. They did have one meeting with the UN, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, but nothing really came of that. We saw, 2 days ago, on the 14th, Erdogan came out and said that he thinks that him and Putin are agreeable that it needs to continue and that he hopes Putin will visit in August, which is different than what he had said the day before when he mentioned September. And the day before that, he had mentioned August. So I would say that whether or not Erdogan is really speaking to Putin and they're really actually planning a meeting and what that looks like is probably a little bit more up in the air than what he's presenting to the general public. I will be the first person to point out, especially because OPSEC's here and he'll fight me on it, that Erdogan always fights for Erdogan. And he is generally much more positive in his presentation of the facts than might be accurate. And even though he can be useful, especially in this particular case of the negotiations for the Black Sea Grain Initiative, don't pretend that that's happening for any reason other than the fact that it benefits Turkey. Turkey's economy right now is a disaster. If you've watched any of the announcements, even just this morning, they raised the taxes on gasoline 21%. Your companies businesses cannot continue to operate if your economy is starting to fall apart and your prices for things that you need in order to operate have increased 20% just overnight. At some point, your economy is going to fall apart. So a huge portion of what goes through the Black Sea Grain Initiative does stop in Turkey along the way for processing. They are the third biggest importer of grain from Ukraine. And so the majority of that grain gets processed and is then transshipped to the next location. So this initiative really does benefit Turkey in big ways, and that's why it's partially so important to them. Obviously, there's lots of other discussion about why Turkey and Russia cooperate economically, but specifically just in the terms of grain processing, it benefits Turkey. We saw Gutierrez send a letter to Putin this week, essentially restating a offer that the EU would work to connect a subsidiary of the Russian Agricultural Bank to the SWIFT international payment system. That was not a new idea. It had come out about 10 days before that actual announcement. And the last we heard from Putin 2 days ago, he said that he hadn't actually seen the letter. So it maybe got lost in the mail. That's really unclear at this point. From there, we watched Russia send a whole series of Shahed drones to Odessa and specifically try to hit the port area of Odessa earlier this week, which is notable really because they, as part of their agreement to the Black Sea Grain Initiative, they agreed not to strike any of the ports of Odessa. And so this really was a quite visible response to probably Zelensky's visit to Snake Island, possibly the release of the Azov leadership group from Turkey. Could be a bunch of other things, but it was absolutely trying to point out that, hey, we still can strike these targets, and don't forget that. And also, secondary to that, they had some bombing runs on Snake Island, which they haven't been targeting anytime recently, but this week they made a point of doing so. Mr. Bond, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just jumping in with a question. I also saw the reports this morning that there were Ukrainian drone strikes on Sevastopol, which included both aerial drones and reportedly some unmanned naval drones. If I recall correctly, the last time that there was a naval drone attack on Sevastopol, it was 2 or 3 days before the expiry of the previous 120-day run of the Grain Initiative. Do you think that the timing is, there's causation in the timing, that both sides are saying this is coming to an end, so we're going to kind of escalate the stakes to say that we can both be taking action sort of in the naval port area where otherwise we had been at truce?
So yes, absolutely believe that there is an increase in strikes, both missile attacks, Shahed attacks, and Ukrainian USB attacks around renewal dates. I have had this discussion with a number of people, and not everybody sees that correlation. And so I have tried to find that data. It's hard to put it all together, and I'm a really busy person, and I just haven't put it all together yet. But I absolutely believe that there is an increase in attacks around every single renewal date. OPSEC?
Do you believe that Turkey is going to enforce the grain deal if Russia pulls out?
I knew you'd do that. I'm just kidding. I don't know what Turkey will do. Austin, I'm interested to hear your answer to this question too. So you get ready. You're on batter up. So I don't know what Turkey will do. I think that there's every reason that Turkey would be interested in doing that. In the past, we have seen Russia specifically tell Erdogan that Turkish ships would not be targeted when Russia pulled out of the grain deal after the very first USV attack on Sevastopol. Putin specifically told Erdogan that he would not attack Turkish flag ships. He was talking about commercial ships, but there is more to that story, and I think that there's a possibility that could happen. I find it hard to understand whether or not all of the steps that it seems like Ukraine and Turkey took last weekend when we saw Zelensky visit Snake Island and visit Turkey, all of these things, if those steps were meant to kind of push Russia into agreeing to prolong the grain deal, or if they were really telegraphing, hey, we are going to keep going with this, it's up to you whether or not you're going to play the game. And I think, honestly, they might be happy with either of those deals. I wouldn't be happy with either of those deals. I would like Russia to get lost, and I would like Turkey to start securing some ships going back and forth. But Austin, what do you think?
Yeah, can you guys hear me all right?
Yes, sir.
All right. So, I mean, throughout this conflict and over sort of Erdogan's administration over that tenure, right, Turkey loves to play, or at least look like a fence sitter. And I feel like the Black Sea grain deal is no sort of difference from that trend. In regards to them actually enforcing, as OPSEC sort of brought up, I would say for now, no. However, if more commercial ships are getting hit, then we could start seeing, them being escorted. I doubt we'd see them escorted by Turkish ships all the way into, Ukrainian territorial waters. But, at least over the Black Sea, if Erdogan wants to signal that, hey, these are our ships, we're going to protect them, everything like that, as Turkey, has been signaling in regards to their enforcement of the Montreux Convention thus far. However, when it comes to Turkey, as Exit brought up, the Turkish economy is not doing well. I believe it was 2 days ago that they just tripled their petrol taxes, trying to get their monetary public policy situation under control. If you want to look at a currency that radically bounces more than the ruble, then the lira is your place to go to. If you look at a chart of the lira over the last year, it looks more like an electronic dance track than a normal sort of currency curve. So Erdogan's going to be focused on a lot of domestic stuff. I think first and foremost is going to be the economy. Number two is going to be internal security concerns with Kurdish dissidents. Well, Kurdish dissidents by Turkey's term, freedom fighters, independence advocates by Kurdish terms there, which is why it's quite peculiar sort of looking at Turkey's spin around on allowing sort of Sweden's accession to NATO and everything like that this is coming off of the tail of, I believe today, Sweden convicted a man of funneling money into Kurdish groups like the PKK. So Erdogan's two major priorities are going to be domestic. They're going to be the Kurds. They're going to be the Turkish economy. On the global stage, in regards to foreign policy, Erdogan loves to look like a deal maker. He loves to, project the idea that Turkey is not just is more than a regional power, that it can come between sort of Russia and NATO and, get business done, so to speak. In that regard, where Turkey is going, what Erdogan is thinking, only Erdogan really knows that. But what he does have is he has the mandate and the backing to sort of do what he wants in regards to pushing a deal, protecting ships, everything like that.
And so just as a reminder, up in the nest, I put some material. We have so much material, we're not going to get to it all, but I put some material on Turkey, their request for extradition, and then Sweden, the court blocked 2 extradition cases. But I've noted in recent talks that Sweden has actually completed 1 extradition about 2 weeks ago, I believe, and then had 1 domestic conviction for terrorist financing under their new law. So it's sort of a mixed bag in terms of Sweden's demands. And I have some other Turkish material I'll put up in a moment, as we may not have time to get to it in too much detail. We'll go to Colby, and then I do have one or two questions for Exit, just to get back to the Black Sea grain questions. Go ahead, Colby.
Thanks. So on the Black Sea grain initiative, I think that the biggest risk here is not that Russia is going to start sinking civilian merchant vessels, either Turkish flagged or other countries. I think it's more likely that if they want to prevent Ukrainian grain exports, they're going to keep hitting the port of Odessa rather than risk further international blowback from sinking neutral ships in the Black Sea. I think that would probably be the more likely course of outcome if they decide that they're not going to continue participating, and if they decide further to that, they want to actively try and prevent grain exports.
Go ahead, Exit.
Yeah, I'll just second Kobe's assessment of that. There is lots of precedent, if you look at the Iran-Iraq war, for shipping companies to continue shipping in really dangerous positions where ships are getting targeted. It's not implausible that people would continue to ship, and it's possible that Russia would attack ships. I, like Colby, think that that's actually fairly unlikely, because it just, I mean, you're going to get a lot of blowback on that. However, attacking the actual port areas of Odessa, there's 3 separate port areas there, that has the biggest chance to be successful for them, because there's not enough AD to actually cover that area. And they've already shown just this week that they can have strikes. They were very limited strikes. They didn't do a ton of damage, but if they're not in the Black Sea Grain Initiative anymore, they have nothing stopping them from officially saying, okay, yeah, we're going to start targeting these now. And ultimately, that would do far more to stop and control the exports, even long term, than actually targeting ships would.
Just a reminder that Exit's thread she put out today with many of these details is the 3rd item up in the nest, just behind those articles on Sweden. So do check that out. So Exit, I know there's been talk about preparing exports either, more through the Danube, or greater export by rail. Like I saw the other day, I believe it was Slovakia proposing a rail transit corridor deeper into the EU, potentially to avoid some of those countries like Hungary and Poland that had made objection to import of Ukrainian grain. Do you know, do you think those efforts are bearing fruit? Do you think they're ramping up enough that they can bear some of the load if the grain deal doesn't continue?
They absolutely can bear some of the load. Ukraine has just started, in the last 3 weeks, basically, they've started the 23-24 harvest. They still had reportedly 3 to 4 million metric tons of grain and foodstuffs left over from last year. It's unlikely that they can continue exporting in a way that is economically beneficial to most Ukrainian farmers to get enough of that grain out. They've tried to do that last year, and there just isn't the same capacity. And it's not even that it's a capacity issue so much as you spend so much extra money on logistics that your grain is no longer economically viable compared to other grains of the same grade. And so you just can't sell it at the same rate, and you end up losing money as a farmer or an exporter. So you can only do so much with those ports. The same with the Danube ports. You can take up some of the availability there, but ultimately the Black Sea Grain Initiative and the ports along the Black Sea are the most useful way to actually export grains from Ukraine.
David, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, she's 100% right. The Black Sea Fleet, the Black Sea Initiative is the way to move, but I don't think that's going to be an issue because from what I saw, the strike on the Snake Island was limited. It looked like they missed quite a bit, and hitting a multi-square mile stationary island is quite a bit different than hitting a moving ship that's got quite a bit of ground clutter behind it. Because if they move along the coast, they're going to have trouble at that range to differentiate ground clutter versus a ship moving. That's all.
Yeah, and so there's the practical considerations about safety. I know Exit has also been following developments to either guarantee insurance, war risk insurance that may already exist, and or to have Ukraine sell or issue its own war risk insurance. Do you know, I understand that the guarantees have been implemented by an order of cabinet, but do you know whether they have passed the legislation to issue their own insurance yet?
It does not appear, so kind of. It was voted on in the RADA and passed the vote, but was passed back to the committee to add more information from the Finance Committee. And so the actual legal text of the legislation for the war risk insurance is not approved yet, as far as anybody knows. And definitely we haven't seen it published yet, which it would have to be before it was actually law. I was talking to some Ukrainians this morning. The idea that they have, based on statements from the Ministry of Infrastructure, is that is most likely a matter of timing and them choosing what time they would like to present that information and have it become law based on whatever happens tomorrow. So it's really that there's a whole bunch of balls up in the air, and tomorrow is the day to watch and see what happens.
As a last question, do you happen to know what the price of grain has been doing, and or I thought I heard the other day that it's not uncommon, but that Nigeria, I think it was Nigeria, had declared food availability emergency. Do you are there projections about what may happen either price wise or in some of the most at risk regions?
So demand had dropped a lot, and grain prices likewise dropped a lot. It has started to pick up in the last 2 weeks or so. Wheat prices have been up for most of the week, not drastically, but they've been up. How that continues is really just based on demand. Nigeria did specifically declare a national emergency on food security this week. At the same time that Moscow specifically has pulled out of, they're intending to pull out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. They've talked about not allowing the same kind of World Food Program transports for Syria. They appear to be pulling back on their cooperation with the UN in general. And then specifically, we saw this morning that South Africa's President Ramaphosa spoke to Putin, and it was mentioned clearly in his readout that they talked about the importance of continuing exports of grain from Ukraine. It does not appear from everything I've heard or seen that Putin seems inclined to listen to any of that.
Kitty, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. I'm just wondering, is it right that there are some grain-producing nations who actually don't want to see the Ukrainian grain released because it's depressing their own prices? And do they make any difference, those concerns?
That is a matter of which farmer you talk to. Last year, grain prices were very, very high. There was very little grain, and there was a huge demand for grain. there was a lot of farmers who looked at the demand for grain and looked at the prices for grain, and they may have sold some of their grain, but they didn't choose to contract out all of their grain because they thought prices would keep going up. And so they held on to some of it. And then prices started to drop. And they got very unhappy about the fact that they hadn't sold their grain when prices started to drop, and they were now, quote unquote, losing money. That doesn't actually mean that they were losing money. It means that they didn't sell them at the high prices that they wanted to sell them at. And they weren't very happy about that. You will never find a grain farmer who is happy and excited about what he got paid for his grain. He always wants to get paid more money for his grain. It's absolutely true of every grain farmer across the entire world. There's absolutely grain farmers who would love it if Ukraine's grain didn't make it out of Ukraine and didn't hit the market, because that would raise prices. And there's a lot of other farmers that would get paid handsomely and would make more money. And anybody who runs a business pretty much wants to make more money. That doesn't mean that it's good for the rest of the world, and it doesn't mean that that's the way that that should go. That's just an economic battle that they're trying to fight. And I have lots of opinions on that, which I probably won't voice here.
And so for those of you who don't know, Exit has been publishing a report on the ships heading out, the numbers, quantities of grain, and sort of the speculation, political scuttlebutt every day since the grain deal began. We're now in the third 120-day period. It's the second last day, so she's been at this for 359 days. Which is quite an accomplishment. So do go check out Exit's work. Exit, were there any last points that you wanted to raise, and or do you have any predictions when we chat again on Thursday, whether we'll have a resolution, like we'll have any clarity, whether a re-signing or, some sort of big significant event?
It very much seems like the U.S. wants to kind of let Russia hang itself for a little while and have to deal with the consequences of pulling out, which from some of its allies probably won't be really positive. Ukraine, even if they do try to continue the Black Sea Grain Initiative or some form of it, it will probably take a couple of days to kind of put things in place in order to do that. And it's unclear to me that the UN would cooperate with a scheme like that, because the UN has signaled very strongly that they still want to work with all of the parties. And before anybody gets down on the UN, there's lots of things that I don't agree with on this particular strategy with them. But I will point out that the people who are doing the actual work in the Joint Coordination Center are some of the best people I've ever met, and working really hard in really difficult situations to enable this. So don't give them any shit. You can give lots of other people in the UN crap, but not those people. I don't know that we're going to have a whole bunch of clarity in 4 days. I think that people are going to take a little bit of time to sort out what's going on here. And I don't think that Russia's in any rush to get that done.
Okay. Well, I guess, once again, I appreciate your dedication to the issue. It's the sort of, a focus that I think leads people to doing really good work. And so it's often a theme that comes out from the folks who come up to speak with us and who have been dedicated to an issue for a long time. So I appreciate that. And we will keep an eye on it. So if anything comes up on Thursday or by Thursday, then we'll chat about it again. So thanks very much for the update, Exit. Okay. So I was hoping to move on to have a bit of a discussion about the status of Wagner. We've invited some friends of ours who are particularly interested in this subject, including Casus Belli and OPSEC. I know that Austin follows them fairly closely as well. So I think what I'm going to do is take just a couple of minutes to mention some of the very latest updates. And then I know that most of our guests have a particular interest in the activities of Wagner in Africa. I don't think any of our most immediate updates relate to Africa, but I haven't really had an opportunity to dig in with our guests into their backgrounds and sort of how they do their study. So I might just bounce a couple of questions by them and sort of have a bit more of a collaborative session to understand, how they're doing their work, just to set the expectations. So running through the material in the nest quickly, if you have a look at the first item, in the last few days, the first evidence has started to emerge that Wagner fighters are actually moving to Belarus. And so the first tweet is by the Belarusian Hagen Project, who does some of the best work on the ground. They have lots of contacts on the ground in Belarus. And they suggested, I think they said it was something like 60 vehicles, if you read down through their thread. And, so that at most would be several hundred fighters. There was an estimate that the camp can probably accommodate somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 fighters. Initially, they were talking about 8,000 would be sent, but the count of the tents suggested a capacity of maybe more like 5 or 6. The second item in the nest, also from the Belarusian Hagen Project, they literally mapped out the route that initial Wagner column took through Belarus. If you do a search on Twitter for sort of Wagner column, there have been a bunch of videos in the last few days claiming to be Wagner columns driving through Russia to Belarus. Several of them, for some reason, are all photographed around Voronezh, which is maybe coincidental, maybe not. I suspect many of the Wagner fighters would have been moving from Rostov, where I understand they had a lot of their base, to north so that they can cross into Belarus. Ironically, though, a lot of them would be driving along a similar route that was taken by the Wagner column as it pushed toward Moscow in the revolt. I will say that several days ago, there were videos coming out saying, here is the Wagner column moving to Belarus, and it definitely was not. It was repurposed footage. So just keep in mind that if you see those claims, they're not all true, but it appears they are now arriving in Belarus. The third item back in the nest is just a confirmation. The BBC published, Ukraine acknowledged that, yes, we're now also through our intelligence seeing that they're in Belarus. The fourth item back, I'll partly apologize for because it's Prigozhin in his underwear, but it's also evidence, the tent material and color seems consistent with the tents at the Belarus camp. I mentioned this one partly because there was a little bit of controversy around this when it was initially published on Telegram channels. The Telegram channel asserted that the metadata said that the photo was taken June 12th, which was being latched onto by folks on Twitter. Some of them were going with, near to conspiracy theories. Like there was one tweet I saw that said Prigozhin was killed by Putin and this is all a fake. And I said, well, there's this picture of Prigozhin. It looks like he's in Belarus the other day. And they said, oh, no. The metadata said that was June the 12th. But ironically, if you scroll down in that tweet from the Belarusian Hagen Project, the fourth back in the nest, you'll see that same Russian Telegram channel that said it was taken June 12th came back and said, oh, no, that was, we mistyped it. It was July the 12th. So I'm fairly confident that is Prigozhin in Belarus. And beware people tossing out conspiracy theories. If somebody comes back and says, no, the metadata says June 12th, don't take their word for it. Try and find the answer. The fifth item back in the nest is a video put out by Belarusian media that is saying that Wagner is going to undertake training of Belarusian troops, and that there was some discussion of some Belarusian forces being moved around the country. So there was speculation about their training cycle being adjusted for this. The sixth item back in the nest was an announcement that Belarus put out that they have now developed a roadmap. So it's not just they will be undertaking some training, but that they have developed a specific plan. I don't believe that roadmap has been made public, but if I'm mistaken in that, or anybody has insight into it, let me know. My understanding is that the Ukrainians have noted the Wagner presence there, but they've said essentially we're watching the northern border. I think there was a statement about a week ago saying they may move a few territorial defense forces back toward the north, but for the most part, I don't think the Ukrainians are regarding Wagner's presence there as a serious threat yet. Further to the Wagner issue, the seventh item back in the nest. So this is a tweet from Zoya Sheftalovich, who is an editor at Politico. We mentioned on Thursday, the Kremlin had come out and for the first time, said that Putin met with Prigozhin, I believe something like June 28th or June 29th, and with some of his commanders. And when we first mentioned that claim, I noted that there was the potential for there to be political bias in it, that it was, the meeting likely happened, but the way it was being characterized, may have an agenda to it or a purpose to it. Now, an interview was given to Kommersant, the Russian newspaper, with more details about that are claimed about that meeting, including that Putin apparently wanted Wagner to continue operating as a fighting force, but potentially with a different command structure. And the assertion is that Prigozhin rejected that. And some have suggested there's an implication that there is a bit of a split in support in Wagner command, but that's, to my eye, that is speculation at this point. And then Putin subsequently came out and made some confusing statements after about 2-3 weeks ago, disclosing that Russia had funded Wagner for many years, and he talked about having spent something like $3 billion on funding Wagner in the last year. He recently came out and said, oh, well, Wagner as an entity doesn't exist. We have laws on PMCs. They're not a real thing. And so it just seems like they're sort of throwing whatever theory at the wall to see what sticks. But if you're following it closely, you may want to read that interview he had in Kommersant. Two last points on fallout. We've previously talked about how Prigozhin's influence empire is, some of it is being transferred to Kremlin control. Particularly, it's something like the National Media Group, the chairman of which is Putin's mistress. Some of it is being closed down. I understand RIA Fan and I think Patriot Media, and some of the related entities apparently are shutting down. And so these two last items, the 8th and 9th in the nest, there's a tweet by Kevin Rothrock that links to an FT article, talking about Prigozhin's toxic media empire and how it's been left in limbo, which is kind of a state of play. And then the 9th item back in the nest is an interview that, or a series of interviews that were given by people who work at some of those closing media outlets, who are starting to spill the beans on things like, we had one floor where the personnel were entirely for spying on and providing disinformation on Russian opposition politicians. They have given details about how they would hire actors to claim to be Ukrainians who were victims of Ukrainian shelling, so they were definitely paid actors. So all of these details are starting to come out now that, you know, the paychecks aren't flowing. And so if you'd like details, you should check those interviews out. And so given that, I'm going to shift over to our guests. So I'll say, you know, thank you for joining us, Cassius Belli. Thanks for joining OPSEC. How are you guys doing?
Thank you for inviting me this evening. Maybe OPSEC want to talk to? I don't know.
I'm doing well. How are you?
Yeah, thank you. I'm doing very good, and I'm glad you invited me tonight to talk about all these very interesting topics. I took some notes today to just structure my what I want to say.
Sure.
And basically, it's very interesting you talk about the new deployment of Wagner in Belarus. Actually, it was confirmed that Prigozhin went for a few days in St. Petersburg, probably to get back his stuff, you know, and he left to Belarus. And indeed, we've seen lots of convoys going to Belarus, and so far they're training their units. But I think my subject tonight is more focused on Africa, and more especially on Mali, which is probably the most interesting area for Wagner, actually.
Well, so I am excited to hear that. Would you mind if I asked one or two questions of you, so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better? Because you've spoken with us once or twice before, and I've followed your work for a long time. But I there are some things that I don't know about you, and so I understand you work with the All Eyes on Wagner project. So are you a member of that group, or do you just cooperate with them?
No, I'm a member of the group, and I basically work with them. It's like a volunteer work, so it just gives them some time when I have some free time. And basically, we published lots of reports on Wagner activities in Africa, like in Mali and Burkina Faso, and also Sudan and other countries. Some of these reports ended in the U.S. State Department, and it permits the sanctions on the Wagner Group. So basically, the latest sanctions were focused on Jamville, for example, which is a Wagner company in Central Africa. And they were producing diamonds and reselling them in Europe, especially in Belgium, which is a huge market for diamonds. And anyway, we've made this report, and it really helped the people to put sanctions on the group. So just to go back on Mali, I wanted to sum up the situation. Maybe lots of people don't really know what happened there. So I'll start with France, and you will understand what I want to say. But basically, in 2014, France was deployed in Mali to face lots of terrorism that were happening in Mali. And basically, the country asked for help from France. And from that, France deployed there as part of Operation Barkhane, which ended a few months ago. And they were sent there for almost a decade. And I think it was a mistake because we stayed too long there. I think we've done almost the same mistake as Americans in Afghanistan, but that's another topic. And basically what happened is that there were in 2020 2 coups in less than 1 year. So basically there were lots of instabilities. Local population were very angry at corrupt leaders. It helped to come in a new leaders in the country. And after the coming of the new leaders in Mali, they asked France to leave. And of course, it led to the arrival of Wagner. And this is how it started. It started basically end of 2021, so 2 years ago almost. And I think I was almost among the first noticing their presence because I had my own imagery. and I published them on my Twitter account. They're pinned on my profile, and this is how we notified their presence. And I remember I tweeted this information even before the French chief of staff back in time, and it was kind of funny. But anyway, this is how it started. And the main point, the thing you have to understand is the Wagner offensive in Mali started also online, and as many knows, they have lots of troll farms. They have like a project which is called Project Larta, which is basically you could say the same as recent troll farms, and all of these troll farms have the objective to influence the public opinion in Mali and force the new leaders in the country to be in favor of Russia and also in Wagner. And basically, they were also supporting local Pan-Africanist NGOs and influencers. And you can say that we have seen that also online on Facebook, for example. We have seen a lot of Facebook pages sharing both anti-French posts and also pro-Russian and pro-Wagner posts. Even in Ukraine, it was sometimes also related to the war in Ukraine, like praising the Wagner group and saying like, hey, they are so strong, they are fighting Ukrainians, etc. And it helped to influence basically the public opinion there. And for example, there's a local NGO called Yerewolo, which you can still find a video I published 2 years ago. And the leader was calling the junta to call for Wagner and help Mali to face terrorism, basically, which is a mistake because Sahel is big as Eastern Europe, and if French failed to neutralize terrorism in this area, you won't do it with few dozens of mercenaries anyway. So. From that, we have seen lots of local protests against France, also against in favor, with pro-Wagner banners and anti-French curtain, basically. And this is how it started before their deployments. Like for the 6 months before the deployment, and they deployed in Mali in around October 2021. We have seen a dozen of demonstrators, and also it's hard to prove. They were probably paid a few dollars. It's how it works in Africa, basically. You can literally just call for some people, give them a few dollars, and you'll have a dozen of people trying to act like protest. And this is how it worked at the beginning. And what we need to understand is that there's pro-Russian networks in Mali, or pro-Wagner in general, surfed on war fatigue and the French prisons. They provided that the French were prisoned for too long in the country with little results against terrorism. I mean, it was better when France was there than today, but still they were surfing on this wave, and the French army was perceived at some point like an occupation army. So this is how it started. And with the project called Larta project, which is among other things content troll farms, as I said, and analyzing Facebook publication, we've seen lots of network being formed and pushed by Russian trolls. It also works on WhatsApp, which is it's widely used in Mali. And basically what they were doing is that they were creating private group on WhatsApp or on Facebook, and they were sharing a lot of pro-Russian and pro-Wagner stuff, even fake news, misinformation, and sharing a lot of links to so-called articles on websites that were managed by Wagner assets, basically. So here again, I recommend you to read the report made by Oliver Wagner called Burkina Under Influence, which lists lots of suspected pages above all and fake news sites, which one, by the way, were hosted in servers in France, which is actually very funny. So that's the cyber part. And on the ground, they've started to pushing pro-Russian Pan-African leaders. I can name here famous Pan-African leader called Kemi Seba or Nathalie Yon, which is also called in France as Sochi Lady, because she used to go lots of time in Russia. And there's many other influencers like this. And by directing public opinion towards Russia and Wagner, the junta was more favorable to welcoming the Wagner group. You have basically to understand that with so much political instabilities, the junta first reflex was to strengthen its security and acquire military capabilities thanks to the Wagner group. It's exactly the same thing for the Central African Republic, which have basically almost the same problem, not very with the terrorism, but with rebels. But basically, they were just calling Wagner to first protect the leader and ensure its security, and then try to improve national army skills. So the government empowered Holzon, and then they trained the local forces in advanced combat techniques and maintained the Russian equipment sent by the Kremlin. And here too, you can see a teamwork between the mercenary and the Russian government, with one supplying helicopters and planes, for example, among other vehicles and other stuff for Malian army, and the other, like Wagner, just maintaining this equipment. So this is also another service they can provide to the Malian government. And on the public, once the public and the junta were convinced, the first contract were signed. But unfortunately, we don't have any access to the details. And around the end of 2021, like in October 2021, I began to notice the presence of Wagner Group in Senou Airport, which is basically the biggest airport of Bamako, which is the capital of Mali. And you can just go on my profile and you will see all the bases, and I still follow the development there. And it was also matching with the local reports we had. Like, we were starting to hear about a potential Wagner presence, and then we saw like Russian planes coming to Mali, and then slowly we have seen this base being constructed right next to Senou Airport. And at the same time, at the beginning of 2022, the Malian junta asked France to leave, and this is where the Gossi incident happened, which is basically a mass grave with dozens of bodies filmed and published near the French base in Gossi, which the French had already left. The interesting technique here is that the video published on Facebook, but also on Twitter, was published by a fake Twitter account, just created like 48 hours before the incident. And it was reposted on different social medias and trying to accuse France from this for this mass grave. Unfortunately, at this time, France had anticipated that and something could happen, and they sent some drones to cover the areas, and they recorded a few white males recording the mass grave and just trying to spread misinformation next to the base. In front of the body, while France had already handed over the Gossi base to the Malian forces. So, and by the way, the Malian government announced that they were opening an investigation, and even today we don't have the answer for this investigation, which is actually very funny since it created a lot of diplomatic problems between both countries. And as far as Mali is concerned, it's important to understand that Wagner's offensive also takes place in the cyber domain, as I said, and as I know how to do it very well. Like, for example, in St. Petersburg, we had opening reports about the recruitment of Wagner students, Russian students who could work for Wagner, and the students were studying French. So we know that they're recruiting and offering jobs for Russian students with very well-paid positions for people able to speak in French, so they can feed their troll farms and also keep spreading misinformation. And this is also a proof of them trying to specifically target French-speaking African countries and also France, basically, and its national security. And the second part on the ground is the presence of mercenaries, and many of whom came from Syria, according to our information. And whose local leaders is Ivan Nazlov, by the way, which is a guy wanted by the Ukrainian intelligence services. And we know today that Wagner mercenaries with the national Malian National Army don't hesitate to get involved in raids against ethnic minorities, burning down the village and their village and executing civilians suspected of cooperating with the terrorists. And on that, I've shared some imagery, which was shared by Bellingcat, because back in the time I found a whole village burnt. I will share it now in the discussion. I don't know how it works. Okay, I will just take a few seconds. And yeah, okay, it will be shared now. And Bellingcat back at this time shared my work, and basically and as I said that they burnt a whole small village with ethnic minorities and just accusing them of terrorism, but basically just like in Central Africa, they don't really make any difference between terrorists or just Muslim populations. So basically, if they have any doubt about you, they will just shoot you and burn everything. And yeah, finally, I'm just looking at my notes concerning the most important point, and which is like the financial aspect of Wagner in Mali. To date, we don't really have an entity created by Wagner in Mali concerning the exploitation of gold mines in the country, which is, by the way, one of the country's biggest export products. But you should know that there's a lot of artisanal mines in Mali, and it's very common. It's also used by terrorist group to exploit civilians. Like they basically just force civilians to work with them, and they take profit from this artisanal mine. You just have to scratch the ground, and you will find a lot. You will find gold. And beside you, you have the same thing in neighboring countries in Sahel, like Niger and Burkina Faso. The whole area is full of gold, basically, and there's lots of artisanal mines. And so they are suspected of getting their money from the Malian government, which lets them help themselves to an officially registered artisanal mine. Basically, they just give them an access to an artisanal mine which is not registered in the national notes. And we also had access to documents concerning the Malian public spending, and in particular to the Malian intelligence services. And we can see that there's budgetary excesses that do not correspond to any public expenditure. For example, we're talking about intelligence budgets that have risen from 3 million euro from 108 million euro in 1 year. And at the same time, we have also Stephen Towson, which is the head of AFRICOM, which in a publication said that the Wagner contract, according to his own information, was worth 9 million euros at the time. So we have kind of an idea of how Wagner make money in the country. And I will end here, but today with the foot of sanction, I think that just Wagner is more interested in raw resources, such as gold, which can be used by the Kremlin for their monetary policies. Like, they are trying to build a anti-dollar system, which is backed with gold. So I'm assuming they're just trying to find as much gold as possible in other countries. And that's it. And this gold is easy to sell in Dubai and other well-known platforms for the gold business. And I think in the last sanction, some companies in Dubai were asked to cease this gold business. And that's it. This is a big summary, but that's it.
Well, thank you for that. That's a very good review of their engagement in Mali, Wagner's engagement in Mali. And it's all the more impressive since English is a second language to you. So thank you for that. In addition to the item that Casus Belli put in the nest regarding the attack on the village of Mankanu, that Bellingcat retweeted, I also added some of his material to the nest, the second and third items that refer to the report he did is Burkina Faso under cyber influence, and his work on identifying Wagner bases in Mali, just as an example of the work that he does. And it's impressive that while France and some UN missions have had physical presence there, the work that All Eyes on Wagner has been doing seems to be fairly comprehensive on the information front in terms of their business, which has led to sanctions applied by the United States and others, but also looking at the connections with the Malian government and their disinformation efforts. So it seems like All Eyes on Wagner is taking many different tacks there. And so I know we may have some questions because we have some with us who follow Wagner in Africa closely. I was curious, and Casus Belli, you can choose to answer or not to answer, but I'm curious, are you based in France or are you based in Africa?
Trying to not read my website, but
sure.
Basically, basically I'm just based in France, but I have my own experience in Africa, so I kind of know the places we're talking about.
Okay. And if people were interested in contributing to the work of All Eyes on Wagner, because we do have some among us, for example, who can track financial flows or do administrative work, including in a variety of languages, would they reach out to the All Eyes on Wagner account, or should they message you just to offer help?
About that, there's many ways. You can just shoot a DM to All Eyes on Wagner account, or you can send me a DM on my Twitter account. You can also go on allaysonwagner.com and reach their email and try to contact them. They're always responding quickly, and also we are trying to put in place some forms which can be used by a local population, so they can help us to report on Wagner activities. So I think it was shared on All Eyes on Wagner Twitter, but if not, I will just share it on my Twitter account. But yeah, this is basically how you can help.
That's very interesting to draw in the local information gathering. In exploring networks of people doing open source work, there's a surprising amount of people in France, or there are large French-speaking communities who are doing this work. Does All Eyes on Wagner participate in the broader community, or as in how did you guys come to meet each other? Was it through open platforms like this, or did you just meet through other means offline and then come to work together?
I will just talk about my experience, but
Sure.
first I was already following the Wagner group, because when I started my Twitter account, I was like following different things in Africa, because like, you know, just most of people were not really interested in Africa anyway, and I always thought that this is maybe the most interesting area for me, because you know, when there's not lots of people talking about it, there's a lots of shady events happening there. And I was following all these developments about Wagner, especially in Mozambique, which is a big failure of Wagner, by the way, and also in Libya and then Central Africa. And since I was among the first noticing their presence in Mali, because I was suspecting them coming in the few weeks, I was looking like every day on some different location and asking some contacts on the ground. And this is how it started. Basically, I just tried to see if there's anyone in the OSINT community that wanted to work on this, or maybe just try to map it. And then I just started to talk with all of Wagner's members, and they were opening me the door, I'd say. And this is how it started. And I think you asked another question, but I forgot. Oh, yeah, I think you asked about the French community in OSINT. I don't know.
Well, I did, but that was to wonder whether you came together because you were already participating in the French OSINT community, or whether the focus was specifically on Mali or Wagner.
So just clarify some stuff. Like the French community in OSINT is pretty small, because this is still a new discipline in France. It was not very famous before the war. I mean, obviously the war in Ukraine put the light on this discipline, but prior to that, there were not that many people, and I was closer to American and British community in OSINT, and this is how I personally started. But today, Wagner, the Always a Wagner project is linked to another open source project called Open Facto, which is a NGO, and which regroup lots of journalists and other things, and they have a lots of branch that work on different topics, and Always a Wagner is just a branch of this NGO.
I didn't know that. That's interesting. And of course, the work that All Eyes on Wagner does and that you do is interesting on its own. But I do like exploring how these groups come to be built, because I'm hoping that we can help to not necessarily build our own, but to contribute to others who are trying to build projects together. So we'll go around for hands. I'm going to go to OPSEC first, and so Cassius Belli, if you haven't had much chance to interact with OPSEC, he follows the activities of Wagner fairly closely. And so you two might have some interesting conversations later. But OPSEC, go ahead.
Yeah, so I've definitely been in contact with Belly. I was just going to say to Quebecsit, but maybe that's a bit off track here. But yeah, the French community is definitely interesting. And I would say it's definitely thriving, especially in West Africa. But it does not get the same type of engagement that we get from English language Twitter.
It's interesting. I think there's lots of opportunity to promote more interaction. So I'm glad that Cassius Belli can join us. And I know that there are friends of us among us who do some auto translation work, like Ben, who's listening. And I think there's lots of opportunity to promote take work that is done in English and translate it to be available in French and Spanish, and likewise take great work from French or Spanish or other OSINT investigators and translate it to English, so that we're all cooperating a little more and breaking down those barriers. I'm going to go to my co-host first, so I'll go to Kitty and then Exit.
Yeah, I don't know if OPSEC is also going to give us some history. Mine may be a little off topic, so you can skip it if you want. But I'm interested because the Islamic Republic of Iran has been moving into Africa and Mali, and they're looking for both economic and defense ties. They make a lot of money selling weapons, and they have in common the Palestinians who Mali supports, and so does Iran. And I'm wondering if the IRGC and Wagner might be having any rivalries in Mali and how that would play out.
So far, for this specific question, I don't have anything that could prove or point any proximities between IRGCs and Wagner. I think the Iranians are more interested in spreading their own influence in Mali, and especially spreading their religion in the country, in the area, because I don't know if it's very well known, but there's a growth of Shia communities in Africa, and I think this is how they try to build and reinforce their influence in the area. That I think that Mali was often under like Saudi or Qatar influence in terms of religions. So I think this is more this question that they are interested in. But yeah, I was surprised first to see Iranians coming to. Actually, it was Malian coming to Iran, and I think both try to find a way to escape all this difficult situation for them. Like the Malian government is facing potential sanctions on, they were just international instances are maybe refusing them some budgets like IMF, etc. So they're trying to find another way to get some finance and support. And of course, Iran with Russia and China and other countries are just in this logic, I think. But just to answer your initial question, I'm not sure that IRGC have any ties with Wagner so far.
Yeah, I was meaning more competition, but yeah.
Given that your organization's name is All Eyes on Wagner, your presentation to us today was about their influence in Mali. I understand there's discussion about Wagner's activity in other locations in Africa. Does your group look at any of those activities?
Actually, we're building a map of their activities in different levels, because in some African countries, they were never present. Like they never sent any mercenaries on the ground, but they still operating their troll farms and try to, just try to influence local public opinions. And yeah, we're working on it, and we're basically monitoring all their activities on Africa, but also in Belarus, and of course in Ukraine and Russia, of course.
Well, that's interesting. We'll look forward to those projects from All Eyes on Wagner. We'll go to Exit and then CC. Go ahead, Exit.
So my question is actually for OPSEC. I am wondering, from your perspective, what has changed about your understanding of Wagner after starting to work with All Eyes on Wagner?
So I actually haven't been working with that group, but what I would say is my understanding of Wagner has done, I wouldn't call it a 180, maybe like 90-degree turn. It is a different group than what I started looking into. They have completely changed. The fact that Prigozhin has actually come out and claimed ownership of the group, like this is something that we all kind of knew. He was intrinsically tied to the group, just like Utkin, but it was never discussed openly. So it's interesting seeing
kind of the change between like these operators that come through this pipeline straight from GRU to, well, conscripts. Like it's a different organization.
So we'll go to Cece for her question, and then if OPSEC had a comment, we'll go to him. Go ahead, Cece.
Thanks, I appreciate it. And bonsoir. Comment allez-vous? Merci pour tout. I had a couple different questions here. So I was wondering, one, is Libya, do you guys, I know, follow Libya a little bit, yes?
Yes, of course.
So I was just wondering, do you have like specialists that work in oil, or if I was curious about, how do you pronounce the Wagnerian company that works with Haftar, the oil company, Naftar, something like that? You know anything about that?
Yeah, I see what you mean, but I forgot its name now.
I mean, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But is there a way, are there good resources to track kind of like how they, you know, because gold obviously can be put on planes, but with oil, just how are they just taking their 10% or 12%, or are they actually shipping oil back, or do you know anything about that?
To be honest, I'm more focused on Sahel countries like Mali, Burkina, and all these countries, and Sudan as well. So I don't have a lot of eyes on Libya. I know there's some members that work on it, but we don't necessarily share all the information for security reasons. So I can't really give you specific numbers about it, but. Maybe I could ask some questions, like, for maybe the next time, and if I have something that's cool.
No, it's quite specific, so no worries at all. Another question was, are like in Sudan, your area's a specialty, are the kind of like Riverside Kitty's question, but with Chinese, are the Chinese seeing, you know, entrepreneurial opportunity and having companies where they can swoop in and either buy from Wagner or partner with them?
Well, actually, it happened. It happened in Central Africa with the picture I shared on Twitter. I think it was shared a lot of time on Twitter by this Chinese miners. They said they were saving them, but it's possible that they signed any contract with the Wagner Group just for this specific mission, since they are probably the only prisons there. But in Sudan, I haven't heard anything similar. So I think Chinese are just doing their own business, and Wagner too. I mean, they have their gold mines. For now, they haven't been really active in the country.
Okay, and then last question is, so with the gold, I just assumed planes, but is that something that I would rather liquidate closer to where the mines are, and then kind of take the money from there, or how do you liquidate such a heavy raw resource?
You have very well-known places like in Dubai, for example. You can just go there. There's a entire gold market, and usually you have lots of companies that don't really ask you questions for if you provide them gold. So what they do usually, from what I know, because there's many other way to do that, but they can just ship the gold from Sudan and other countries and go to Dubai. They will have some contact there with companies, and they will resell the gold there and make money. The other way is that they also can directly sell it to the Russian government. And once you have sold it on even in Dubai, if you melt it, you can't trust it again. So it's very difficult to find the origin of gold.
And you said they're cracking down in Dubai, though, correct?
Yep, they were using
compliance.
Dubai. Yeah, they were using Dubai as a big platform to resell the gold, and there's lots of small companies there that don't really care about compliance, and yeah, they just taking everything.
Okay, thank you so much.
Great,
Appreciate
thank
it.
you.
I found your assertion that because Russia is hoping to build a currency system backed by gold, they may have a more strategic interest beyond just the commercial value of the gold. An interesting one. So that's one I'll have to keep in mind. We'll go to OPSEC, and then we'll probably take Jane as the last question for Casus Belli. But go ahead, OPSEC.
Yes. So one of the things to keep in mind with China is they are very good at small scale operations. So they don't really need Wagner. They can set up these gold mines they have and take as much as they want and then move it. It's not a lot to invest in an operation like that. So we have seen China do this time and time again, even in places where you wouldn't necessarily expect. But my understanding is about 40% of the gold that was extracted from Ghana 2 years ago was taken by China. And this was all done small scale. So they don't need Wagner to execute that type of operation.
Interesting. Jane, please go ahead.
Yeah, I have just one question, and this has been fascinating. This is sleazy dealings and how to do them on a very large level, it would seem, in Africa. But how do you see, do you see the interplay with China and their desire to extract resources beyond gold from African countries that need money? Having some connectivity with Wagner that can provide them, if you will, a potential business stream in the long run. Or no, sir, not so.
If I understood properly your question, you were asking me if the Chinese are playing their game in Africa and exploiting more resources, right?
Well, yeah, I think that's a known thing. I'm just asking, do you think Wagner has got an angle to make themselves economically and fiscally helpful to the Chinese and create a revenue stream for themselves? Just, off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think that since Wagner and basically the Russian are catching at everyone's attention in Africa, of course, Chinese are doing their own business. And, in Africa, you don't often hear about them, which is, you could say, a sign that their business are going well. Of course, they are more present than Russia, actually, in Africa, especially on the mining sector. They are present in almost all the country, and they are exploiting lots of cobalt, coltan, and so on. And meanwhile, for Russia, you only have 2 or 3 maybe big mining companies in Africa. And you also have Wagner, which is, you don't forget, which is a private company. So they are also seeking their own benefits. So I think it's I don't really know a lot about Chinese companies in Africa. I know they are very present and they are exploiting more than Russian. But I think since this is the CCP ruling in China, they have a full control of them. And we have seen this last week that Wagner sometimes just avoid the control of the Russian government. And based on that, maybe I can say that Wagner also was seeking its own profits more than Kremlin benefits sometimes. So, yeah, this is all I can say.
Well, thank you for that. We'll go to OPSEC, and then I have one last question for you. Go ahead.
Yeah, so China's been very focused on small scale extraction So they've been doing this with illegal fishing operations as well as gold. The one thing I would point to is I do think that there are larger goals, or there were, for Russia, specifically in Mali. I think that end goal was to get bauxite, but I don't see that happening, at least not for quite some time, because that is going to be a much more complex operation. And now that we've seen Prigozhin sort of get caught up in this snafu, I think they'll focus on the small-scale gold extraction for quite some time.
Interesting. So I have one last question. The specific question can probably be answered by either Casus Belli or OPSEC. Maybe I'll preface it by asking, so Casus Belli, you've had some questions about Iran and China, and you have had some questions about activities outside of Mali. So we understand that you're tracking Wagner in Mali, you're tracking Wagner in other African locations, but the All Eyes on Wagner project, are there people among it who are interested in OSINT work more broadly in Africa? Like, are they interested in African stability, or is the focus very much Wagner?
The focus is very much Wagner because they are very present in Africa. So of course we're working on like the political stabilities and try to understand how the things are going in those countries. But we're also following them in Syria, for example, which they are deployed, and also in Venezuela. And also, which is a country often forget by people, and also in Ukraine and Belarus, and of course Russia. So yeah, we're basically very focused on them, and we're also focused on their members, because I can tell you that some of them, for example, are ex French Foreign Legion. So we have some information about them. So even in France, we can just track them, and it's not about the country, but it's more Wagner focused.
So this last question may be a little bit out of scope. It's more about African stability, but it could intersect with your interests. We had somebody on YouTube ask the question. Apparently, President Bola Tinubu, who I believe is of Nigeria, today announced he's planning to strengthen the ECOWAS standby force in an effort to deter coup in other African countries. Do you have any thoughts on whether these sorts of regional forces can be used to stabilize, perhaps contrary to, to prevent the instability that Wagner aims to sow?
This is a very difficult question, honestly, because I'm very focused on Wagner, and also I don't follow that much what's happening in Nigeria, because it's also not a French-speaking country, so it's just easier for me to follow the things happening in French-speaking countries. But
well, and so you're welcome to weigh in if you have an opinion, but it's totally understandable if it's beyond scope, because we all, have our areas of focus.
Yeah, this is not. I'm not skilled in this matter, but I guess it's a positive thing for maybe countries, but I can't tell much because I'm afraid to say bullshit, and I don't really know a lot about the country, unfortunately.
That's fair enough. We have one or two hands up who may want to respond to that last question. So we'll just take those last comments, and then we'll move on to updates. I think the first hand was Woke, and then we'll go to Colby.
Thank you. Yeah, just directly to that. Thanks for having me up. And Riverside was in this space, the space prior to this space as well. So confirmation from her would be great, or maybe she left early. But anyways, the Iranian space that I was just in for quite a while with some experts, Iranian experts. IRGC is doing all of this. IRGC is in Africa recruiting an army. IRGC is the answer to a lot of the questions that you guys had in the past few, since I've been here, regarding a lot of these efforts. So when you say Iranian people are going to live in Mali, no, it's the IRGC going and making all these efforts in various different places. So without going into, and I can't regurgitate all the details, even if I wanted to, just coming out of that space, but hopefully that makes sense.
Well, I'm glad that you're focused on the topic. Colby, go ahead.
So regarding ECOWAS, they certainly have been, they've engaged in peacekeeping operations and sort of stabilization missions in their members to try and prevent the pattern of coups and other domestic turmoil getting too far out of hand. But I'd say that there's limits to what they can achieve on their own without some little outside support from either France or the United States. And the willingness to provide that level of support certainly has been waning somewhat as of late, I would say, obviously with, France pulling out of Mali. There's some there's always uncertainty about America's resolve to engage in these kind of missions. So that's always an open question. But the U.S. does still play a role in the region for sure. Probably not as much as some people would want, because these countries are not particularly well off. They do need outside support if they're going to be engaging in these missions. So just a few thoughts on that.
Do you mind if I add to what I was saying, because I remembered a couple of details? One, do you mind?
Sure, if you can keep it to just a couple of comments.
It will be like less than 1 minute or 30 seconds. The way that they're recruiting people is via religious means. So they're spreading this, extremist Islamic religion in order to recruit. I just wanted to add that.
Right, which echoed Cassius Belli's comments. So thanks for that. Yep. I appreciate you guys weighing in on ECOWAS as well. And I'll just wrap it up by saying, Cassius, thank you very much for joining us. I appreciated your presentation as an overview. And I also appreciated getting to know a little bit more about you and the area of interest that Wagner, All Eyes on Wagner, is focused on. And so a reminder to the listeners that I've moved it back in the nest a little bit, but that some of Cassius Belli's work is up in the nest. And if it's whether it's the African issue, whether it's the Wagner issue, if it interests you, check out Cassius Belli's account and consider giving him a follow. And of course, I appreciated the backup from OPSEC, who regularly comes to chat with us about all things Wagner.
Thank you, Michael, for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to explain what we do. I had some question about how some people could ask questions or reach us, so you can just go on the website alliesonwagner.com or shoot us a DM on Twitter, me or Allies on Wagner account, and we will be glad to answer you. And I wish you all a good night or a good evening. It's pretty late here in France, so I'm going to bed. And thank you again.
Have a great night. And we are slowly working to build connections. We've reached out to others who are interested in following Wagner to come and speak with us, and had some discussions. They just couldn't make it today. So if you keep an eye on this space, hopefully we can make more connections among those who are doing this similar work. Okay, so I'm going to move on to updates on Ukraine. Normally we run this conversation for about 3 hours, so that would give us half an hour left. I will often run over a little bit to try to wrap up, whatever segment we're on. So we may have, 45 minutes or so available to us. I have put some items up in the nest. So I thought we might start with some of the background on the offensive. and just because everybody in dropping into a Ukraine space wants to know how things are going. This is a reminder that there are people who do great, very specific work, detailed work. Usually that requires working on a map, and Twitter Spaces is not great to communicate those details. So instead, what I tend to do is just provide an overview of several of the best mappers. So the first item in the nest includes links to the maps from the Institute for the Study of War, War Mapper, Andrew Perpetua, DEFMON, Project Owl, Poulet Volant, GeoConfirmed, and also because it's always interesting, the weather updates from David Helms, who spoke with us about the Zaporizhia plant earlier. The reason I include many maps is because sometimes they'll disagree on little details. Some of them will include, unit markers, and others just sort of control of terrain. So it's always helpful to compare and contrast. So go to them if you want, the minutia or the latest details. A reminder that at least Andrew Perpetua of those also does a YouTube stream where he will screen share his map and speak to it as he moves around it. So in that way you get, a walkthrough. He holds those talks on Thursday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern Time and Friday afternoons at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, so that hopefully I thought I said Tuesdays at 8 and Fridays at 3? Yes, Tuesdays at 8 and Fridays at 3 Eastern Time. The Friday time is hopefully so that his European friends can join. So you can go to Andrew Perpetua's Twitter account, and I believe there's a link to his YouTube there. Just as generally I cover the developments in the offensive only at overview. I take the approach of region by region, and one of the most interesting updates from the last day, looking at the second item in the nest, it is a claim coming from Russian sources, and it's coming from Igor Girkin, who is not 100% reliable, but who often speaks truth where others are not. And he made the claim that Ukraine has begun to take positions around Staromayorsk, which is, Ukraine is pushing on 3 axes down into the Zaporizhia region. And Staromayorsk, if I'm not mistaken, is south of the Novovelosika of the 3 major pushes. And so, that's progress. When we spoke on Thursday, we also saw some of the first geolocated evidence that Ukraine was making progress into the first of the major defensive lines around Robotyne. And so you see this progress being made on a couple of different points along the front in Zaporizhia. The third item back in the nest is a comment. This is just the overview from the Kiev Independent, that Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar, who regularly provides the updates, had said that around Bakhmut, Ukraine is continuing to make advances on the flanks. I had heard some good news around Klishivka, which is to the south of Bakhmut, in the last day or so. And Ms. Maliar also mentioned that, or confirmed reports we first mentioned on Thursday, that the Russians are actually pushing, in an offensive up around the Kupiansk area, so sort of the northern Luhansk area. So it's kind of a mixed, the Ukrainians are on the offensive in the Zaporizhia region and into the Donbass, but around Luhansk, the Russians are on the offensive. The fourth item back in the nest, this was the first claim of this kind I've seen. I haven't seen a lot of detail around it. It only came out yesterday. The suggestion that the Ukrainians may now be pushing north of Soledar, which is just north of Bakhmut, if so, would suggest there may be an effort to put pressure by threatening a larger encirclement. But I see that X's hand just went up, so she may have more insight into that.
I actually was just going to go back to Staromayorsk. Staromayorsky, to specifically note that the general staff said that Russia had attacked that town, which is really important because Russia attacks where Ukraine is. So that's something that is notable and we should take into account. Sorry, my apologies.
No worries. Exit often will join Andrew on his Tuesday night streams. And so sometimes she'll, hear detail that, in the prep for those that we may not hear unless you're paying particularly close attention. The fifth item back in the nest, again, this is a little bit more speculative, but partly I will include things that are said or that float around that get attention where I think it's worth digging into them just a little bit more. Sometimes you'll hear the headlines, particularly as translated into English, but you won't, the folks who, are repeating them sort of to be the first to break the news don't provide the original source. And so there was a claim on Friday that a Ukrainian spokesman had said that Ukraine was preparing an offensive in Kherson, suggesting that they were going to attempt to cross the river. And that led to, people drawing lots of lines on maps, getting worked up. Now, I can't preclude that, but I went and I found the presentation by the spokesman, the actual video, and you'll see that in his briefing, he made one very brief, it's literally a sentence statement about, Ukrainian forces are making preparation for offensive action in the Kherson region, but he doesn't speak to the scope of it. He doesn't speak to, where. He does say that they're essentially performing some recon. And so without further information, there is still, as I understand it, the bridgehead in the region around the Antonovsky Bridge, north of Oleshki. What scope they will be pursuing in the Kherson region beyond that, I'm not sure. But I included this to say, if you see people getting excited and drawing lines on maps, it's good to double check where they're getting their information before you get excited as well. The sixth item back in the nest is just a little bit more evidence. It was an interesting video where I mentioned that the Ukrainians still maintain that bridgehead near the Antonovsky Bridge. There was actually a strike. I think it's believed to have been on some commanders. And the video, there was live video captured of the strike hitting the van that it was targeting. And so it was kind of dramatic. So I've included it here because you might find that video interesting. If you bear with me, I'll put the next set of material up in the nest. So the first of which is a tweet from Oliver Alexander, which is just a reminder that Ukraine is still, just as it's pushing along the front line, many believe that's an effort to attrit that's an effort by the Ukrainians to attrit Russian forces, but that Ukraine is still simultaneously pursuing a strategy of deep strikes targeting Russian logistics. And so that's just
I think Mr. Bond has had a little bobble. I will take a quick moment to do housekeeping because we haven't yet today, which is super unusual. If you're new here, up above our heads, you can scroll up and you will find what we call the nest. All of the sources that Mr. Bond shares are up there. And when we are done with them being up in the nest, you can go down to the bottom right-hand corner of your screen and there should be a little purple button, or I think somebody told me it was black if you're not a speaker, which will actually go to the tweet for the space. And below that tweet, we always make sure that we share all of the sources that are up in the nest down to that tweet. And that way, if in the next week you're looking for a source, you can go to that tweet. So you might want to bookmark it and find all of the sources that we've shared here. If you'd like to come up and speak with us, on the bottom left of your screen, you can see the request mic button. If you hit that, and it'll send a request to us, and we'll take a look and see if we can bring you up and have you come and join us here. I think he's not quite back yet. I think, OPSEC, I saw your mic.
Yeah, I'm just back. I will put one or two more material in the nest. So if you have a question for OPSEC, feel free to go ahead, and I'll be ready in a sec.
I was just wondering if you had anything else about Wagner that in Africa that you had wanted to share that you didn't get a chance to earlier. I know that's kind of, we're past it, but I always like to ask you that question.
I mean, that's definitely a very complex question to ask. So thanks, Exit. I think the biggest thing is look at the revenue stream that Prigozhin is potentially taking from Africa. It could be billions of dollars, and I just feel like people aren't really talking about that. So if we're talking Mali, South Sudan, Central African Republic, this guy, yes, some of that is ending up in Putin's pockets, but we're not really talking about how much money Prigozhin has made off these endeavors.
Well, thanks for the quick back and forth to cover. Yeah, for those who don't know, I run this space on an emulator, and occasionally it will lag, and I have to just reset it. So jumping back to updates, that first item is in the nest is what I was speaking to about. This is particularly a Ukrainian strike on a Russian logistics point at Uvaleni, and I just wanted to highlight that the deep strikes are continuing. The second item back in the nest was an update from the UK Ministry of Defence, who said that they've trained now 18,000 Ukrainian infantry soldiers so far. And I believe there were reports about a month ago that overall between the UK and the EU, they had trained something like 40,000 soldiers. And so, these efforts are continuing and are very important, even as attention shifts to things that are much more specialized, like F-16 training. Infantry training is ongoing. Also meaning that these trained forces are continuing to build up. So to the extent it's still being reported that Ukraine has not committed the majority of its forces in the offensive push, just as these new vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel vehicles, and so on, are continuing to be donated, new soldiers are completing the training pipeline. And so in theory, new units are being formed. The third item back in the nest, we spoke to this a little bit earlier in connection with the fire near the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, but this was the claim. And so it's interesting, the claim is being made by the Russians as passed along by War Translated, but the Russians are accusing the Ukrainians of setting wildfires and suggesting that the Ukrainians are setting these wildfires in an effort to detonate mines, to clear minefields. And so we had a bit of back and forth about how effective would this be. I'm not sure that it's 100% effective, but given that mines appear to be one of the major obstacles to Ukrainian progress, and that's been written about by several analysts recently, like Tatarigami has published a couple of threads on it. We spoke about those on Thursday, or Dara Massacott wrote about it today. It's interesting if the Ukrainians wind up finding success with something as simple as burning fields. The fourth item back in the nest is a video that went around where some people were suggesting it was the first use of DPICMs, which are the U.S. supplied cluster munitions, because it certainly looks like a cluster munition in the video footage. But several accounts suggested that it was instead a Israeli-designed, Turkish-made mortar shell that uses submunitions. So a cluster munition, just not DPICMs. Lots of people pointed out that the Turks had provided these sorts of munitions several months ago in the debate over their cluster munition use. So this is just apparently an example of those being deployed. The fifth item back in the nest was an interesting point, I thought. It's a sort of insight where, it's an inference, but I think valuable. It's the tweet from CJ, who is very, he, I think, served in an artillery unit and knows quite a lot about artillery, made the observation that for much of the last year, Ukrainian artillery units have had to operate as one or two guns at a time so that they can, shoot and scoot, because the balance of artillery artillery fire was in the Russians' favor. Now he's seeing videos where Ukraine will have 4 or more artillery pieces firing together. And, what he's suggesting is that may imply that the balance of artillery power is also shifting, because Ukraine is less worried about counter-battery strikes. This also lines up at the beginning when I spoke about resources, and I highlighted the record of offensive losses so far put together by Nalcio. Even though the ratio of total equipment pieces lost is almost 1-to-1, if you were to have a look at it, and I'll try and put it back up in the nest in a moment, you'll note that the Ukrainians have lost something like 3 times as many personnel carriers, APCs and light armored vehicles, whereas the Russians are losing 3 to 4 times as many artillery pieces. And it may be that influence that's leading to this change in artillery balance of power. So if you bear with me, I'll put a couple last points up on the offensive, and then we'll move on to some items on Russian command. And if one of my co-hosts might be so good, if you were to look in the section in the agenda on resources, the tweet from Nalcio is what I was referring to, and that way the audience can have a look at the ratio of lost artillery pieces. That would be appreciated. So these last points are just on some recent attacks that are notable. Sorry, one last one to put up. So the first item in the nest now should
Mr. Bond,
populate. Yes.
You have a mic issue. We'll see you in a minute. Which gives me more time to talk to OPSEC, which is awesome. OPSEC, how's it going? I had another question, a follow-up question to that. So money in the millions, obviously they, I guess ultimately, can Wagner afford to single-handedly exist off of what they make in Africa, is what I'm really wondering. OPSEC may have stepped away.
Well, if that's the case, I'll just keep running. I appreciate your efforts to cover for me. Oh, OPSEC, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so I'm still here. I think that is a very difficult question because we don't really know how much of that money is going back to, the Kremlin or Prigozhin's business partners. On paper, if we just looked at what they've taken out of, let's say, Mali CAR, yeah, I would say they definitely have enough money. But we don't know how much of that is getting kicked back up to Putin or whoever else is helping them operate.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, again, sorry for the little glitches. This last block on recent events that I'll connect with the offensive, but they're starting to get a little bit more far-flung. During Exit's presentation on the status of Black Sea Grain Initiative, I asked a question about this morning's attack by drone on Sevastopol. And so the first item up in the nest is more detail on that. It's from our friend Sam Bendet, who's brought together some resources. He's included a map. I think I recognize this as the graphic style of the Rybar map. So, if it's coming from a Russian source, he provides the link to the Rybar Telegram channel. It's coming from a Russian source, so do take it a little bit with a grain of salt. But it, is making a suggestion about the route that was taken by the drones. And in Sam's tweet, he's also quote tweeted the video of the Russians attempting to destroy the naval drones. And we had a brief back and forth with Exit about, the implication and whether these sorts of attacks by Ukraine tend to be associated with the end of a grain deal. And so hopefully Exit will find some time in the next week or so to relax and maybe dig into some of these threads she would like to put together, like correlating the attack dates with the grain cycle renewals. The third item back in the nest, actually, I guess before I go on, Kitty, do you want to go ahead?
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to let you know that the Ignacio tweet you wanted is in the nest in the beginning there.
Perfect. Thanks very much for finding that. The third item back in the nest, this is coming from Russian claims. So again, take it with a grain of salt. But I've seen different versions of this. I've put up the tweet by Kevin Rothrock, which is one of the most neutral. And I do that intentionally. So he's linking an article from the Moscow Times about how the Kursk nuclear power plant, which is in Russian territory, has reportedly shut down one of its units today. And that this has happened in association with a drone having been shot down nearby. Now, there are more sensational versions of this going around, suggesting that drones have been detected or shot down near multiple Russian nuclear power plants. The reason that I explain it this way is if you were to look at the fourth item back in the nest, there was footage that came out of the drone that was downed near the Kursk plant. And it was noted that it had a Taiwanese-made engine in it. And so it's not in this tweet, but I've seen other analysts who have said that, this looks like a unique drone. It does not look like a drone that is known, because none of the known drones use an engine of this type, or from this manufacturer, I should say. Suggesting either there's been innovation in the drone manufacturing, or some have suggested that the pushing of the narrative of the drones approaching Russian nuclear sites is for Russian purposes, and that these drones may not be Ukrainian drones. And again, none of this is confirmed, but I want to explain it to you because it's a narrative that may be floating around out there, and it's either innovation in Ukrainian drone technology, or it's in support of a Russian narrative around risk to Russian nuclear plants in an attempt to justify the risks that exist around the Zaporizhzhia plant. I'm not sure which of the two it is. If anybody finds further evidence on this sort of debate, please feel free to bring it forward. The fifth item back in the nest, and I think this may be the last in, oh no, it's not the last in the block. The fifth item back in the nest was just an interesting article put up by the New York Times, discussing how Ukraine reported that in its first 2 weeks, something like 20% of the vehicles that it sent forward in attacks were damaged or destroyed. it was reported that I think it was the United Kingdom's, in their Ministry of Defense daily update, they also noted that Ukraine appeared to take a pause in its offensive actions around that time. And then the New York Times is reporting that after that pause and apparent adjustment, that the rate of weapons or vehicle loss for those committed to the offensive has now dropped to 10%. And so, that's an interesting insight. I haven't taken the time to try to correlate that against the Oryx losses. The Oryx losses may not come in rapidly enough to associate it in time to, prove that. But it would be interesting if Ukraine had managed to cut its vehicle losses in the offensive by essentially 50%, right, from 20 to 10. Based on adjustments learned in the first few weeks. And then just as by way of background reading, there were 2 interviews that were released just in the last few days. So the 6th item back in the nest is a link to the interview that Reuters had with Budanov, who is the head of I believe it's the Ukrainian military intelligence. And then the 7th item back in the nest includes a link to an interview conducted by the Washington Post with General Zaluzhny, who's the Ukrainian commander. And both of those interviews had interesting revelations in them. One that came out particularly from the Zaluzhny interview that caught attention was Zaluzhny saying that if Western allies in providing weapons with longer range are saying that those weapons cannot be used to strike Russian territory, that Ukraine itself will use their own domestically manufactured weapons to carry out those strikes on Russian territory, which starts to raise the question about why is there a particular distinction being made on the place where the weapons are manufactured? If Ukraine, can on its own produce its own weapons and strike into Russia. So those were great interviews. Let me just look at where I am in my agenda, and we'll see what we still have time for. So I think what I'm going to run through is I'll do 2 more blocks, one of which is on some upheaval in the Russian command system that's continuing. It's a theme we spoke about first on Thursday. And then I'll highlight a couple of developments in provision of equipment to Ukraine, and I'll probably wrap it there. And we did manage to cover the Wagner material earlier, but again, we might not have a chance to get into the econ material, so we might have to push some of that forward. So let me put up these points on Russian command. What we discussed on Thursday were some basics. So the first of which was that a video was released of Gerasimov back at work, which appeared to have been released in connection with speculation that Gerasimov was no longer in command over events in Ukraine, that he had been replaced in that role by Teplinsky. And the idea was that those rumors may have prompted the Russian Ministry of Defense to release video of Gerasimov just to assert that he's still in the role. We also heard about the removal of a general by the name of Popov, who worked with airborne units after he was accused of blackmail by Gerasimov, and that blackmail took the form of a letter he wrote that was essentially complaining about lack of rotation of Russian forces and the burden it was imposing, and of the imbalance of artillery power, particularly counter battery fire. And there was a lot of ink spilled by Russian military bloggers who were not very pleased with Popov's removal. Following on that ongoing storyline, the first item in the nest is this is War Translated, who is passing along a post that again came from a Russian mill blogger site, but it purports to be a complaint from the Russian 7th VDV Brigade, so Airborne Brigade as well, noting the removal from command of two other, I believe one is a general and I think one is a colonel, and I think the general is Silivestrov, and I believe the colonel is Kornev, who were, I believe, respectively also from the 7th and the 106th VDV divisions. And this complaint is saying that if there is similar treatment of Teplinsky, you know, along the same lines of these others who have recently been removed, that may lead to, pushback, uprising. They don't say exactly what, but that there would be consequences if Teplinsky were removed from command, and that they're frustrated with the recent removals. Given that came from a mill blogging source, I wanted to note in the second item back in the nest that this is Dara Massicott of the RAND Corporation, who pays close attention to Russian command structure, and she had seen enough independent reports of the removal of Siliversterov. Excuse me, I still didn't get that right. That she decided to write about it as well, and to note that it was causing discord in the ranks. The third item back was the one claim. So they were noting these other two commanders removed. This is the tweet from JR2. He was noting these two commanders being removed, just as the other post did. But then he also suggested that a Major General Ramil Ibatullin had been removed from command of the 90th Tank Division. So I wrote to him to say, where are you seeing this? And he sent me the Telegram channel where the claim is made. And then he has since, in the last few hours, followed it up to note other Telegram channels who are now announcing the replacement of a new commander in place of General Ibatullin. And so, again, this is not 100% confirmed, but it does seem like there is a more wholesale changeover in Russian command going on. And clearly, some of those within the forces themselves are not pleased by it. Along those lines, and I understand we're wandering into the political, the speculative. So again, we present different scales of information, right? We present explicit geoconfirmation, but then we do wander down to things that are unconfirmed because that's the feedstock for later analysis. So the fourth item down in the nest, it's a tweet by Evergreen Intel. She's simply providing the English translation of a statement made, again, coming from Russian mill bloggers. You can find the source in the quote tweet. But essentially what it's arguing is that there is a division in culture in the Russian command, particularly as between the Southern Military District and the Western Military District. And my understanding is that the Western Military District covers Moscow, and so would be those closest to, to the top command of the Ministry of Defense. And that the Southern Military District appeared to be a bit more of a fighting force, perhaps less political command. And so the suggestion is that many of those commanders who are being removed were associated with the Southern Military Command at the behest of those in the Western Command. And so it's interesting to think about it in those terms. I hadn't seen it presented precisely that way, so I thought I would highlight it to your attention, which feeds into the fifth item in the nest, the tweet from Konstantin Sonin. And again, this is political. this is more opinion than anything else, but he's noting that historically, often the threat to a regime comes mainly from those generals who are in the field. And so this flow that as I've laid it out, from these operational commanders being removed, some forces apparently complaining about their removal and suggesting that if there are further removals on those lines, there will be problems. The identification that some of them are, from the Southern Command, who, are being removed by those from the Western Command, and this idea that ultimately many nations that launch offensive wars are stopped in that effort by the change in opinion motivations of field commanders, I think, works toward a compelling narrative. So I wanted to lay that out. I'll put up one last block of text. I mean, if anybody is interested in commenting on any of that, you're welcome to, as always. But otherwise, I'll put up one last block on some developments in Ukrainian equipment, and then we'll call it. So the first of these relate to the announcement that the United States is buying some Hawk air defense systems from Taiwan. And obviously there's been a general push for, a variety of air defense systems to be provided to Ukraine. They've received everything from the NASAMS radar systems, the IRIS-T systems, the Patriot batteries, and the Italian air defense systems as well, the Italian French. Several of the military analysts here on Twitter have suggested that the Hawk systems are still perfectly effective as against some slower moving targets, and they may have less expensive munitions, and therefore are a great candidate to supplement the more sophisticated air defense systems already in use. And that there may be more of these Hawk systems around the world for them to gather up. So that first item in the nest links to the article on this. There's been lots of writing on it in the last day or so, but it's linked to the article from the Drive. But I see that Colby has his hand up. Colby, go ahead.
Thanks. I just want to point out that based on current reporting, it seems that we're just talking about the missiles and not the complete systems themselves, although this is still, very much unconfirmed. It was, just sources within Taiwanese government that was saying this. We don't have any formal announcements from the United States who are allegedly procuring this, so I wouldn't call it official until we see these included in a USAI package. But my understanding based on current information is that it's going to be maybe 100 of the missiles, but not the launchers or any of the associated radars.
So can you remind me, it's not on the tip of my tongue, what systems can these missiles be used in?
By Hawk. So Hawk is the...
because I see. The United States has already provided some launchers, so it's just additional munitions for the launchers they have.
Spain was first, and then the United States, I have to double check. I don't know if the United States actually provided any launchers itself. It might have sent I think it sent a few, but Spain was the one that sent like the actual complete system. And the United States was working on sending some of its own missiles from storage that they had. So it would be more munitions for the launchers, but it wouldn't be getting Ukraine new complete batteries per se.
Well, thanks for that detail. I have seen some in connection with this, I guess it's speculation technically, suggest that there are other potential users of Hawk systems around the world who similarly could be reached out to for additional munitions. Do you happen to know who those might be?
Who the other Hawk operators are?
Yes.
Historically, it was a very long list of countries. Hawk was basically like the beyond the NATO standard air defense system, or surface-to-air missile system for the United States and most American aligned countries during the Cold War. So it was very ubiquitous. There's still, I don't have the list off the top of my head, but there's a number of countries that were still operating it, or until very recently were operating it. So potentially there's quite a lot of these that may still be in inventory around the world that could be procured. And it's something that a number of different people have been talking about since the beginning of the war, to get Ukraine more air defense, because obviously the newer, more capable systems are typically available in much smaller supply and need to be built, which takes time, right? So like things like NASAMS or IRIS-T, these all have to be made by industry. There's not huge quantities that are available that could be donated. So there's just long lead time. So with Hawk, there's potentially a lot of missiles and launchers available that could be immediately sent.
Great, thanks for that. I just had heard about the idea that there were many users out there, and I wasn't sure who might be sort of the next target on the list in order to try to solicit additional munitions from. But given there are so many out there, we'll just keep an eye on sort of a repeat performance, and hopefully we get confirmation of these Taiwanese Hawk munitions shortly. The second item in the nest is just a reminder. It's links to an article from Politico that some of, I believe it's an issue tied to the simulators, the trainers for the F-16, and that while many European countries have pledged to begin training Ukrainian pilots soon, and we saw more detail on those pledges come out of the NATO meeting in Vilnius, that apparently the United States still needs to provide further approval, and I believe that approval is tied to the use of the simulators, and that approval has been tied up and not forthcoming. And so I'm not sure what the the anticipated schedule for that is. I get the sense that it should and could come anytime, but there's been some confusion as to why it hasn't, the approval hasn't come through already. But Colby may have detail on this.
So evidently, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said today on CNN that this has been approved now, but I would personally just wait and see if we can get something like a formal announcement out of the Department of Defense, out of the State Department, that it has in fact been approved, rather than just taking him at his word. I think that the decision allegedly has been made some time. The United States has been saying, "Oh yeah, we're in support of this," but they haven't been taking the actual action to really get things moving. So hopefully we see something more concrete. Because it just hasn't been, we've been waiting for a long time for the actual approval to happen. So Sullivan saying, yeah, it's approved now, is not the level of clarity that I would want to see, or certainly that the Ukrainians would want to see. So
great. Well, I hadn't seen Sullivan's comments, so thanks for clarifying on that. And again, I'm with you that we hopefully will see a formal commitment soon. So we just have 3 items left. The third item back in the nest is a link to a Financial Times interview with Armin Papperger, who's I believe he's the CEO of Rheinmetall, which is the German defense manufacturer. And there's been lots of discussion about Rheinmetall building a plant in Ukraine. And I may be corrected here, probably by Colby, but I think there had been speculation that they may build the Fuchs armored vehicles at that plant. In this interview, what he says is that initially the plant would be focused on repairing vehicles, and it would only be at a later phase that they would move on to production of Rheinmetall products. And so, again, because I know lots of you follow this, if you hadn't read this article, you can check it out, mine it for details. The fourth item back in the nest, I thought was an interesting one. Probably not the kind of equipment provision that even those who are interested are following closely. It was an announcement that the firm Nibulon, which is actually an agricultural firm, had constructed the first of, I think in this tweet, they say how many? 15? Yes, 15. So they prepared the first demining vessel. And, that probably will have important implications. I'm not sure if the intention is to use these mainly because they do say that it's for inland and coastal waterways, suggesting that it's, not to demine the bulk of the Black Sea. And I'm not sure if these are intended for use immediately because of the threat of mines even along some of the river systems, or whether it's because of the, post-war threat of unexploded munitions. But Exit may have more details for us.
I was actually just coming in with a reminder that Nibulon is the same agricultural company that earlier, I think it was last fall, the CEO of the company was targeted with his wife in their house in a missile attack, and they were killed. And his son took over the company, and they've been making some big moves in putting in new loading areas on the Danube, and just generally wherever they can be successful and put more money into the Ukrainian economy. They have worked really hard to do that, despite the fact that a number of their locations are actually in Russian-held territory, and so they aren't making the same income that they used to. And so watching them branch out into this new venture, I would just say keep an eye on them generally, because they have an axe to grind, and they are grinding it as hard as they can.
I haven't dug into it yet, but it would be interesting to discover whether these demining vessels are the sort of thing that they're making available to the government for general use, or whether they're, creating it for their own purposes, because clearly they move a lot of goods, a lot of agricultural product by, river transit. And so it may just be in their own interest to work to, remove mines in that context. Yes. Okay. The last item in the nest is a graphic that was created following the announcements of various aid packages at the NATO summit in Vilnius. And so I had a quick look at it. Most of the numbers looked pretty good. You can't always rely on graphics of this sort, but it is often fun to see them visualized. So I thought I'd include it because there were lots of announcements. In the material I prepped on Thursday, but we didn't get to. I included a tweet that had a sort of summary of all of the various announcements in it. So there's quite a lot, but seeing it here in visual form is pretty interesting. Okay, so I think with that, we'll wind up. Hopefully some of the little bit of material that we didn't get to today, we can push forward and hopefully speak about during our next conversation on Thursday. Just a reminder to those who may be new, I hold these talks every Sunday afternoon starting at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, and every Thursday night starting at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And now, unfortunately, because the way I posted my thread today, it didn't post correctly. I don't have handy the usual link to the next space, but have a look at my profile, or you can always do a search in the spaces function for Bond, and usually it returns only my spaces. But if you have an opportunity, set a reminder for our discussion on Thursday night. And so I think with that, I'll wrap up, and I'll say thank you to all of our listeners for coming by. Thank you to all of our speakers. In particular, we heard from David Helms on his study of that fire near the Zaporizhia nuclear plant. We heard an update from Exit on the Black Sea Grain Initiative, whose formal term wraps up tomorrow. We heard a presentation on All Eyes on Wagner and Wagner's operations in Mali from Casus Belli. We had contributions to those conversations from OPSEC and Austin, so I appreciate you guys coming by particularly. And then just to the audience, pretty well all of our speakers today have been following the events in the war since the beginning. So I'd suggest, check out their profiles, consider giving them a follow. And I'd like to say thank you to my co-hosts, to Exit and to Kitty. Without your guys' help, it would be really hard to do these spaces. And then I guess a final reminder, again, if you check the thread, I think I maybe put it at the end. These spaces are streamed to YouTube as well, so you can always go back to catch past episodes if you'd like at the YouTube account of our friends. So with that, I will say I hope that I see you guys on Thursday night, and have a great night.